Forest mysteries.
The wolf pup had no name for what warmth was not yet. He knew the packed heat of the den, the press of his siblings' bodies against his ribs, his mother's low breathing above them like a slow tide. That warmth was something alive, something that moved and smelled of pine needles and wet fur and belonging. But this warmth was different. This warmth came from a box in the wall that roared quietly to itself, orange light bleeding through iron slats, and it asked nothing of him in return. That made it strange. Strange things in the forest meant danger. His mother had been clear about that. He opened his eyes and immediately wished he hadn't. The ceiling was low and flat, not bark and earth, but pale wood, smooth and unnatural, cut into perfect edges that no tree ever grew. The smell was overwhelming. Smoke, yes, but under it something sharp and medicinal that stung the inside of his nose, and under that, the unmistakable dense scent of human sweat and iron, and something he could not name, something both hot and cold at once. He tried to lift his head, and the pain in his sight answered immediately, a deep grinding ache that radiated from just below his left shoulder blade down through his belly. He let his head drop back onto the folded cloth beneath him. He lay still and listened. The fire in the wall ticked and popped. Outside, wind pressed against something solid, a door, maybe, or a wall of boards, and the sound of it was familiar, but muffled, as if heard from underwater. Somewhere nearby, a liquid sound dripped at even intervals into a metal container. The whole place hummed with a quiet he didn't trust. In the forest, quiet like this meant something was watching. Something was watching. He turned his head slowly, ignoring the pain, and found the man. He sat in a wooden chair on the far side of the room, forearms resting on his knees, his big hands folded loosely together. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was just watching the pup with pale gray eyes set deep under a heavy brow, and his face held no expression that the pup could read, not hunger, not fear, not excitement, just attention. Patient, steady, unreadable attention. The pup had never seen that on a human face before. He had seen humans at a distance from high ground, the way his mother taught him you keep the wind in your face and the ridge at your back, and you watch and you do not move, and when the human passes you wait 3 full minutes before you breathe normally again. That was the rule. Humans were fire and noise and metal and the distant crack that split the air and made the deer drop mid-stride. They were not something that sat quietly in wooden chairs with patient eyes and waited. His instincts sent a clear message, move. His body replied with equal clarity, no. He tried anyway. His front legs pushed against the rough cloth, his claws catching the weave, and he managed to raise his chest 6 inches off the surface before the pain in his side clamped down like a jaw, and he collapsed back, a thin sound escaping him, not quite a whine, not quite a growl, something between the two that embarrassed him, even as it left his throat. The man moved. He moved slowly, the way his mother moved near the den when she didn't want to startle the pups, deliberate and low and without sudden angles. He came off the chair and crossed the floor and crouched down at the pup's level, and the pup smelled him much more strongly now, that complex human smell filling the space between them. One large hand reached toward him, and the pup's lips pulled back from his teeth without his deciding to do it. The man stopped. He held his hand in the air 3 inches from the pup's nose and simply waited again. The pup growled. The man did not pull his hand back. The pup growled again, lower this time, a real warning sound, and still the man held steady, and after a long moment he began to speak. His voice was low and rough-edged, not unpleasant, the way creek water sounds moving over flat stones. The pup didn't understand the sounds, but they weren't sharp and they weren't loud, and after a while his growl faded because there was nothing in the voice to answer it with. Slowly, over what felt like a very long time, the smell of the hand changed. Not the fundamental human smell that stayed, but the top layer of it shifted, the adrenaline in it dissolving, the chemical signature of threat relaxing into something lower and quieter. The pup read the change without thinking about it, the way he had always read the air, and his lips dropped over his teeth again. He didn't let the hand touch him, but he stopped growling. Outside, the wind had picked up. Snow ticked against the window above him in irregular bursts, and the fire in the wall answered each cold gust by brightening slightly, throwing orange shapes across the wooden ceiling. The pup watched the shapes move in thought, in the wordless way animals think about his mother, about the weight of her flank against him in the dark, about the sound she made when she was checking that all of them were there, a low exhale through her nose, almost inaudible, that somehow each pup could hear from across the den. He hadn't heard that sound since she fell. He had heard the bear. He had heard the fight, the crashing of brush and the wet sounds, and his mother's voice rising into something he had never heard or voiced do before and hoped never to hear again. He had heard the silence that came after. He had run, like she always told him to run when she used a specific combination of sounds that meant now, don't look, go. He had run and the ground had tilted beneath him, and the pain in his side had climbed from a distant sting to something enormous and filling, and then the snow had come up to meet him, and that was the last thing he remembered clearly. Now there was a ceiling, a fire, a man with patient gray eyes. Mom taught me to fear the fire and the two legs, he thought, though not in words. She was right about every other thing she ever told me, but this fire warms me, and this two-leg is still here, and I am still breathing. That night tried to leave. He waited until the fire had burned low, and the man had moved to another part of the structure, and the sound of his breathing changed into something slow and regular. Then he pushed himself upright, front legs first, then the back, every movement a negotiation with the pain. He stood. His legs shook, but they held. The door was a dark rectangle at the far end of the room, and cold leaked under it in a thin continuous line that smelled of open air and pine, and the enormous freezing dark outside, and that smell went into him like a key turning in something he didn't know was locked. He crossed the floor one step at a time. He reached the door. There was a step down from the threshold to a wooden porch, and he misjudged it. His front left leg found nothing where it expected ground, and the rest of him followed in a slow, inevitable collapse, and he hit the porch boards with his full weight on his injured side, and the pain blew the world white for a moment. And when color came back, he was lying on his side in the cold and couldn't make himself get up. Snow fell on his face. It was very quiet. Then the door opened and light spilled out across him, and the man was there, barefooted on the cold boards, and he crouched down without hurrying and without speaking, and slit his hands under the pup with the same slow deliberateness as before under the shoulders, under the haunches, and lifted him the way the pup's mother used to carry the youngest one, firmly but without squeezing, and carried him back inside to the cloth near the fire. He set the pup down, he added wood to the fire, he went back to his chair. The pup lay and watched him and breathed. He saw something in my eyes the pup would have thought if he'd had the words for it. The same thing Mom had in her eyes when she turned her back to the wind so it hit Orr and not us. He wasn't afraid of the cold. He went out into it anyway, for me. He didn't understand that yet, but his body stopped shaking, and he didn't try the door again that night. By the time the snow on the windows had grown a gray crust of road dust and wood smoke, the wolf pup knew the rhythm of the cabin so well that he could predict the man's movements by sound alone. Yet the first time he heard the thin, high laughter from outside, he flinched as if someone had thrown a stone at him. It did not belong to the creak of the man's boots on the floorboards, or the deep sigh of the chair, or the steady clink of a mug set down beside the fire. It sliced through all of that, bright and quick and alive, and before he could decide whether it meant danger, the door opened, and the cold rushed in around a smaller shape that moved like a gust of wind wearing a coat. The girl came in trailing snow and noise, her boots thumping heavily for their size, her breath puffing white as she pushed the door shut with both hands, and the pup watched her from his spot by the stove, every muscle tight. She smelled different from the man, not less human, but layered with soap that carried the faint sweet sting of oranges, with crayons and paper, and something sugary he could not name, and underneath all of it, there was the same iron heat of blood, the same quick animal pulse. Her hat was almost as big as her head, and it had two silly knitted ears that flopped when she moved. And when she saw him, she stopped so abruptly that one boot skidded on the wet patch by the mat. For a long heartbeat, nobody moved. The man straightened from the counter where he had been cutting something that smelled of coffee and fried eggs. The girls stared at the animal by the fire, and the pup stared back at her. His whole attention narrowed to the rise and fall of her chest, and the way her fingers slowly curled around the worn leather ball she carried tucked against her hip. He had seen young deer before, nervous and restless, twitching at insects and shadows, but they never looked directly at him like that, with curiosity and fear, and something close to delight all tangled together in their wide brown eyes. "Is that him?" she asked finally, her voice higher than he expected and yet solid, as if she was used to talking in rooms where adults listened. "The wolf you told me about." The man answered, but the pup barely heard the words. He was too busy watching the girl's hand as it moved away from her side, lifting the ball a little, fingers flexing against its cracked surface. The object smelled faintly of dirt and grass and human skin, and something rubbery that reminded him of old tires on the distant road. To him, it looked like prey, small enough to catch in one bite, easy to chase, the kind of thing you grabbed and kept. The girl took a careful step closer, then another, her boots squeaking softly on the boards, and something in the pup tightened in response, not quite threat and not quite anticipation, just a readiness that hummed through his muscles and made his tail twitch. "Hey," she said quietly, and the word meant nothing, but the tone meant a great deal. It was the same tone the man used sometimes when the pup's wound ached and he shifted restlessly, a sound meant to soothe, to ask for patience. "You want to play?" She lifted the ball to her shoulder, and the pup's eyes followed the arc, his body bending without thought as his weight shifted toward his front paws. The man said her name Emma in a warning tone, but it was too late. The ball left her fingers in a clumsy overhand throw and sailed across the room toward him, wobbling through the warm air. And in that instant, every lesson his mother had ever taught him about standing still and watching and staying silent near humans vanished under the simple, bright command of instinct. He sprang. Pain flared in his sight as his body left the floor, but momentum carried him through it, and his jaws closed around the ball with a satisfying give that lit up something fierce and joyful inside him. His claws scrabbled on the boards as he landed, his whole world narrowed to the rubber shape between his teeth, the texture of it, the way his tongue found the worn grooves, the tiny hiss of air that escaped where someone had ripped the seam long ago. He clamped down harder, claiming it, a low growl of triumph rippling in his chest. And when he glanced up, he saw the girl staring at him with her mouth open and her eyes huge, not with fear, but with wonder. "Yes," she whooped so loudly that he flinched. "You caught it." She held out her hands as if expecting something, fingers spread, palms up, and for a few seconds he simply stared at her, head tilted, the ball locked firmly in his jaws, his mind running over the simple equation his life had always followed: you chase, you catch, you keep, you eat or you hide, but you do not, under any circumstances, give the thing back to the thing that threw it away in the first place. The very idea felt wrong in his bones, like walking downhill with his eyes closed, and yet Emma's whole body leaned toward him in an eager curve, her boots forgotten, her coat half unzipped, a flush on her cheeks from the cold and the excitement and the hope. "Come on," she urged, her voice dropping into coaxing tones. "Bring it here, boy." The word boy snagged somewhere inside him. It was not his name. He had no name in their sounds, but there was a warmth in the way it sat in the air between them, something inviting. He shifted his weight, testing his side, feeling the throb that had dulled over the last days, but still answered every sudden movement with a slow, insistent ache. He could turn away, take the ball under the table, tear into it until it was nothing but scraps and spit in tiny pieces on the floor. He could curl around it and sleep, victorious in a way that would have made sense to any wolf. Yet if he did that, he knew without knowing how he knew that the bright light in Emma's eyes would go out. He stood very still, the ball heavy in his jaws, and listened to the layered soundscape of the cabin, the kettle beginning to rattle on the stove, the wind brushing past the eaves, the man's weight shifting as he watched, the faint squeak of Emma's coat when she breathed a little faster, and under all of it his own heartbeat, steady now, slower than it had been when he first woke up in this strange wooden den. His mother's rules whispered in the back of his mind, the ones about humans and their tricks, about never taking food from their hands, about never, ever letting them get close enough to touch your face. They had kept him alive in the forest hard mathematics, yet here, pressed between fire and walls and human scent, something in those rules no longer fit quite as cleanly as it once had. He took one step forward. Emma's breath hitched, a tiny sound that somehow filled the room. He took another, the boards cool under his pads, his side pulsing with each movement, and when he stopped a few feet in front of her, he could see a faint smear of blue marker on her left thumbnail, could smell the faint tang of school glue on her sleeves, could hear the wet click of her tongue when she swallowed. She crouched down slowly, mirroring his level, and held her hands out a little farther, palms up in a gesture of trust that he did not yet fully understand, but could feel the weight of all the same. For a long moment, the two of them stayed like that, suspended between old instincts and something new, and then, as if a small lever inside him had finally been pushed, he opened his jaws. The ball dropped into her hands with a soft thud and rolled against her fingers, leaving a faint shine of his saliva on her skin. She let out a sound that was half laugh, half breath, and it poured over him like warm water, startling and strangely pleasant. Without thinking, he leaned forward, drawn by the scent of her joy, and his nose brushed the back of her hand, cool and small and alive. She froze, then very carefully turned her palm and laid it, feather light, on the top of his head between his ears, where his mother used to lick the fur smooth when they were still blind and clumsy. He did not flinch. Her touch was not like the man's, which was steady and practical and always aware of his weight. Hers trembled slightly, carried a hum of contained energy, and yet there was a softness in it that he recognized from somewhere he could not quite reach. She stroked down his neck once, twice, fingers threading cautiously into his fur, and every part of him that expected pain or capture or some sharp betrayal found instead a spreading warmth that started where her hand moved and worked its way inward, until it settled somewhere near the hollow place his mother's absence had left. She threw the ball again. This time he did not leap, he ran, a low careful lope that kept his injured side tight and his steps controlled, and when the ball bounced off the leg of the chair and rolled toward the stove, he pounced on it with less urgency, more play, his jaws closing just firm enough to feel it, not enough to break it. He trotted back the way he had seen dogs do at the far edge of the logging road, proud and purposeful, and when he dropped the ball at Emma's feet and she clapped her hands, the sound sharp and clean in the close air, he felt something inside him answer with a small startled surge of pleasure. There was no word for this in the language of wolves, no concept in the rules his mother had laid down in that cramped dirt den, yet as the game went on and the cabin filled with Emma's breathless laughter and the man's occasional soft curse, when the ball ricocheted off a table leg and knocked over a mug, the pup began to understand, in the only way he could, that there were other ways to measure strength besides how tightly you held on to what you caught. Winter settled in without asking one's permission, burying the cabin in the logging road and the narrow strip of yard under a deep, relentless weight of snow that changed the world's sounds and shapes, until even the wolf's sharp ears and eyes needed time to adjust. The plow came less often now, its distant grind and clatter fading week by week, and on the days when the wind blew hard enough to erase the tracks from the porch to the wood pile, the man would stand at the window for a long time, mug in his hand, his face unreadable, and then pull on his boots and disappear into the pale blur of the trees to check his lines, leaving the wolf and Emma alone with the fire and the quiet. Inside, a kind of routine formed, as solid as the frost that flowered and receded on the window glass. Emma would do her schoolwork at the table while the wolf lay stretched on the rug, his side mostly healed now, the skin under his fur tight and strange where the wound had closed, and every so often she would reach down without looking, and let her fingers trail along his back, a simple distracted gesture that nevertheless sank into him more deeply than he knew how to name. As the days grew fractionally longer, the wolf's body began to notice something that the calendars on the fridge already knew. There was a restlessness in his muscles that had nothing to do with pain, a twitch under the skin that woke with the dusk and made stillness feel less like safety and more like an ill-fitting coat. When the man opened the door in the late afternoon to shake snow off his coat or call for Emma to bring in more wood, the air that rushed in carried more than cold now. It brought layered scents from the forest that had been muffled by the early storms, old trails thawing at the margins, deer herds shifting in the shadows, and somewhere farther out at the edge of his range, the faint, almost forgotten smell of his own kind, thin but distinct, like a remembered song played very softly. He noticed the collar more. At first, when the man had buckled the strip of worn leather around his neck, the wolf had tolerated it the way he had tolerated the splint, the ointment, the careful cleaning of his wound, a necessary discomfort attached to survival. And because the man's hands had been gentle and there had been meat afterward, he had not fought it. Now, though, as his strength returned fully and his legs no longer wobbled when he ran in small circles around the cabin yard, the constant presence of the collar, its weight and its stubborn refusal to yield under his teeth, began to itch at him in a way that had nothing to do with skin or fur. When he reached the limit of the chain and felt the jerk at his throat, a hot spark flared inside him that was not exactly anger, but was close enough that his vision sharpened and his body hummed, and the yard, which had once seemed huge and rich with new smells, shrank in an instant to a pendant rectangle of trampled snow and flattened grass. Emma tried to pretend she did not notice. She came out bundled in her coat and mismatched gloves, her breath puffing thick in the cold, and she brought the same ball that had started everything, now more scarred by teeth marks and stained by the yard's dirt, and she threw it again and again, farther each day, testing both his speed and the length of the chain. He chazzed it because his muscles wanted to move, and because her joy at his returning still warmed him, but there were moments, more and more of them, when the ball would come to rest just beyond the invisible line the collar allowed, and he would stop so abruptly that snow would spray up around his paws while the leather at his neck cut into his skin, and his lungs burned with the need to press on. One evening, the sun already gone behind the ridge, but leaving a faint bluish glow over the snow, the air taut with the promise of a clear, brutally cold night, the wolf sat at the very edge of his reach, the chain pulled straight, and stared into the trees, while Emma stamped her feet on the porch to keep warm, and talked about something from school that he could not begin to understand. Her words washed over him in a soft stream of familiar sounds, but his ears were cocked not toward her, but out toward the darkening line where the yard gave way to forest. The scents were stronger tonight, pulled low by the cold, threaded with something new that made his skin prickle, and his chest tight in musk and hunger and old snow and wet fur and dominance and longing, all tangled into one complex pattern that no human nose would ever register. The first howl came thin and far, stretched by distance in the filtering trees, a lonely ribbon of sound that rose from the valley like breath from a wound. It cut through Emma's words so cleanly that she fell silent mid-sentence, her midden hand frozen halfway to her face, her head tilting as she tried to locate the source. For the wolf, the sound hit him with the force of a physical blow. His heart lurched. His entire body snapped into a single line of focus, and a deep answering vibration gathered in his chest before he even realized he was drawing breath for it. He had not heard pack voices since the night of the bear. Memory flooded in with the sound, the press of bodies in the den, the rumble of his mother's chest as she called them to her, the way older males had thrown their voices toward the sky to mark territory and strength and presence. That was what the line of sound from the valley carried now, not a simple cry of hunger, but a statement, here we are, this is ours, we survived the winter's first culling, and we are moving again. Without thinking, the wolf came to his feet in one smooth motion that jerked the chain hard enough to rattle the stake, and the answering howl tore out of him so purely that it surprised even him, a note layered with youth and confusion and joy, and a sharp ache that made his side feel as if it had reopened. Emma's eyes widened. The man, inside the cabin, paused with his hand on the stove, listening. The pack answered. More voices now, layered and complex, some higher, some lower, weaving around each other in a soundscape that carried meaning he could feel in his bones, even if he could not have translated it into anything Emma would have understood. There were greetings in it, and challenge, and an invitation that scratched at every part of him, that had ever run with others, every moment of hot breath and cold air at someone else's flank. He leaned into the sound so completely that the yard, the house, the human smells all fell away for a second, leaving only the clean cold geometry of the forest, as he had once known it, trails and roots and rivers and silent communication written in scent and posture and sound. The chain held him. He dug his claws into the packed snow and tried anyway, a low frustrated snarl threading under his howl, as he lunged toward the tree line with a force he had not used in months. The leather cut into his neck, the stake in the frozen ground refused to budge, and his healed side screamed a warning that his brain ignored for one reckless heartbeat too long. His front legs cleared the drift at the fence line, his back feet slipped, and in an ugly tangle of fur and metal and momentum he went down. The air punched out of his lungs as he hit the snow with his shoulder. For a moment he lay stunned, the distant chorus still ringing in his skull, the cold seeping quickly through his fur into his skin, the sharp taste of iron at the back of his throat where he had bitten his tongue. Emma's boots pounded across the porch, her voice high and frightened as she called his name, not a real name, but the one she used when she wanted his attention, and she skidded to a stop near his head, falling to her knees in the snow in a flurry of coat and mittens and wild, terrified eyes. Easy she babbled, reaching toward the collar and then snatching her hands back as if afraid of hurting him more. Hey, it's okay, just breathe, okay? Just breathe. He did not need her words, he needed his lungs to work again, and after a few painful seconds they did, dragging in air that burned with cold and the thick, complicated scent of pack and human tangled together. He tried to stand and his legs trembled under him, the old wound throbbing in time with his heartbeat and the chain pulled tight again, a dull, implacable reminder of the invisible boundary he had just tried to break. By the time the man stepped out onto the porch, coat hastily thrown over his shoulders, the howls from the valley had softened into distant echoes, fading as the pack moved along some path he could almost picture but not follow. The man took in the scene in a glance, the wolf half tangled in the chain, Emma kneeling in the snow with flushed cheeks and wet lashes, the stake leaning at a slightly different angle in the battered ground, and something in his jaw tightened briefly before he relaxed it and walked over at a measured pace that betrayed nothing. He knelt by the wolf, his movements as deliberate as they had been the night, carried the broken pup back inside, and his gloved hands worked quickly at the buckle of the collar. Leather scraped against fur and metal. Emma sucked in a breath, guessing what he was about to do even before the chain fell slack and the collar slid free, and for a second an electric silence hung over the three of them, thick with the weight of choice. The wolf stood very slowly, feeling the sudden lightness around his neck, as if someone had removed not just a strap of leather, but a whole layer of air he had grown used to pressing against his skin. Nothing physical held him now. The snow between him and the trees lay undisturbed, a clean white path that his body could cross in a heartbeat if he chose. And from somewhere far but not unreachable, the last trailing notes of the pack's movement brushed his ears, a final tug at the deepest fibers of his being. Behind him, the cabin radiated warmth and familiar smells. Emma's mitten brushed his flank, not grabbing, just there, a trembling point of contact that carried with it all the afternoons of fetch, and the quiet mornings by the fire, and the sleepless nights when she had sat beside him while he shivered and whimpered in his sleep. The man's hand rested on his back, steady and heavy, not forcing any direction, just existing, the same way the mountain itself existed, a fact, a presence, something you learned to move with or around, but could not ignore. The world seemed to hold its breath. He took one step toward the trees, then another, feeling the shift in the snow's texture, as he moved away from the packed-down paths near the porch into the untouched drifts, where his paws sank deeper and the cold bit more sharply at his pads. Each step loosened something in his chest and tightened something else, and with every breath the scent of the pack grew fainter, not because it was farther away, but because his own immediate surroundings were flooding his senses with competing information smoke from the chimney, the faint tang of Emma's shampoo, the rich undertone of stew seeping under the door. He stopped. His body was pointed at the forest, muscles coiled for the long run that would carry him back into a world that made a simple, hard kind of sense. Yet when he turned his head, just enough to bring the cabin into his peripheral vision, he caught sight of Emma's face. Her eyes were not white and pleading. She was not making any sound now. She was just watching him with a strange mixture of sorrow and pride and fear. And in that look, there was something he had only ever seen on his mother's face before the night of the bear. A willingness to let him go if that was what he needed, even if it tore something in her to do it. He did not understand that fully, but he recognized the shape of it. The pack's call echoed in his blood, the fire's warmth called to his bones, his mother's rules pulled one way, the new softer laws of this wooden den pulled another. Somewhere in the middle was a thin, painful line where he stood, feeling as if his skin did not quite fit him anymore, as if he belonged wholly to neither world and could not imagine yet how to belong to both. After a long time that was measured less in seconds than in heartbeats, he turned around. He walked back to the porch, each step heavy and deliberate, and climbed up onto the boards without help, his side protesting but holding. The man did not reach for the collar again. Emma did not rush him. They simply moved aside, making space for him between them, and when he lowered himself onto the rug just inside the open door, the air around him filled with the overlapping sense of forest and human and smoke, until they blurred into something that, for now, was his only possible version of home. The snow did not vanish so much as thin and shift, receding from the dark trunks of the pines and retreating into the gullies and shadows where the sun's reach faltered, leaving the forest mottled in patchwork, streaked with damp earth and last year's leaves. The wolf tasted the change long before Emma started drawing little green shoots and dripping icicles in the margins of her homework. He felt it in the way the air lost some of its knife edge and gained a damp, heavy sweetness in the way the wind began to carry not just the blunt, clean cold of winter, but the layered, waking smells of soil and sap and old bones, thawing under the needles. His coat began to shed in clumps, tufts of fur clinging briefly to the rough boards of the porch and the legs of chairs before drifting to the floor, and Emma made exaggerated faces as she collected them, talking about how she would make a pillow someday, her voice hovering between joke and secret plan. The man watched all of this with his same quiet attention, his gray eyes taking in both the wolf's restless pacing and the slow slimming of the snowpack on the north side of the yard. When the first morning came that his breath did not immediately frost thick on the window glass when he woke, he dressed earlier than usual, layering shirt and flannel and jacket without turning on the radio, his movements efficient but unhurried, and the wolf's ears pricked at the subtle differences in the routine. There was no chain clipped to his collar any more that had not returned after the night of the howling, yet the absence had not translated into roaming freedom. Invisible lines held him almost as firmly, lines drawn not by metal and knots, but by the man's tone when he said stay and Emma's small hand buried in his fur when she whispered you'll come back, right? This morning, the man opened the door and held it with his shoulder, his boots already laced, his hat pulled low, and he looked down at the wolf in a way that made the animal's skin prickle pleasantly with anticipation, some deep muscle memory of what it meant when an older, stronger creature chose to share a trail. He jerked his head toward the tree line in a small, almost canine gesture, That made Emma's eyebrows rise when she saw it, and he said a few short words that the wolf did not need to understand exactly, because the tone wrapped around them carried the message clearly enough. Come on, we're going. The world outside the yard smelled like a story he had stopped halfway through and was now finally allowed to pick up again. Every tree seemed taller out here, every hollow darker and more promising, the ground under his paws, an intricate map written in overlapping lines of scent and texture and temperature changes that his body read as easily as Emma read or school books. The snow that remained in the shadows was crusted and brittle on top, soft beneath. When his weight broke through, cold moisture soaked his pads, then gave way to the resilient spring of moss and the faint crunch of old leaves. Birds he remembered only as dream noises now flickered between branches, their calls short and sharp, stitching the spaces between trunks with sound. The man moved through it all with a steady practiced gait, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under low branches with the kind of ease that comes from repetition, and the wolf shadowed his path, sometimes trotting a few yards ahead to investigate a particularly interesting smell and then circling back, an instinctive deference keeping him from ranging too far. They followed a game trail that wound along a slight slope, the ground slanting away gently to a tangle of alder and willow near a narrow creek that had begun to groan and crack under the pressure of meltwater. The farther they went from the cabin, the more the wolf's body settled into its old rhythms, his breathing stretching into a smooth, effortless cadence, his ears swiveling independently to catch both the distant rhythmic tap of a woodpecker and the nearer, less regular rustles of something small moving through the underbrush. With every step, the human smells that clung to his fur thinned at the edges, replaced by the wild's rich complexity, yet they never vanished entirely, and that layered scent smoke and soap and gun oil over pine and damp bark felt, strangely, like his true signature now. He scented the blood before he saw the animal. It bled into the air just ahead, a hot metallic thread woven through the cooler smells of mud and water, and last year's rotting leaves, and the wolf's entire body responded with a jolt as immediate and total, as if someone had driven a spike down his spine. His head lifted sharply, his nostrils flaring wide, and his pace increased without conscious decision, his paws finding silent placements on the trail, as if every stone and root had moved into their proper places for him. The man's hand twitched toward the strap of the rifle slung over his shoulder, not in panic, but in simple, ingrained readiness, and he quickened his stride as well, following the same invisible line the wolf had caught. The fawn stood half-collapsed near the creek's edge, one slender back leg twisted at an ugly angle, where it had slipped into a gap between two slick half-submerged rocks. Its flanks heaved, its breath came in harsh frightened snorts that puffed from its nostrils in little clouds, and its large dark eyes rolled white at the edges as it watched the wolf and the man approach. Blood darkened the water where it flowed past its trapped limb, staining the melt with a spreading rust-colored cloud, and the wolf's world narrowed so quickly around that smell and color that it might as well have been the only thing in existence. He moved without hearing the man's low curse, without noticing the way the man's free hand came up in an instinctive halting gesture. His muscles were already coiling, his mouth filling with saliva, his mind filling with the simple arithmetic of the hunt. The animal was weak, alone, cornered between the creek and the slope. Its leg was broken. It would not run far. There was no pack to circle with him, but the distance between them was small, the angles good, the path clear. His paws found the soft mud near the water with barely a sound. His lips peeled back slightly, not in conscious menace, but in anticipation, and a low involuntary rumble gave voice to the deep driving urge that had fed his ancestors for as long as they had had bodies and teeth. Then the man's voice cut through it, sharp and hard in a way the wolf rarely heard. Leave it. The words were not important, the tone was everything. It carried command without room for negotiation, a sudden wall drop between the wolf and his prey, and it struck some trained place in the animal's nervous system, That had nothing to do with the forest laws and everything to do with the long, strange winter in the cabin. His head snapped sideways, his eyes flicking to the man by reflex, and in that fraction of a second, when his focus broke, the fawn bleated weakly, a high desperate sound that sliced under his ribs in a manner entirely different from the clean lines of hunger. He stood there, halfway between man and deer, his body angled toward the fragile animal, his chest rising and falling rapidly, the scent of blood swimming around him with almost intoxicating strength. His claws dug into the wet earth, feeling the give of it, the way it shifted under his weight, measuring instinctively the force it would take to launch himself forward. In another life, the decision would already have been made, he would be moving, his jaws would meet soft throat, there would be the brief struggle, and then the hot flood of life in his mouth, followed by the deep animal satisfaction of a need answered in the cleanest, most honest way the wild allowed. The man stepped between them. He did it slowly, without the sudden threatening movements that would have sounded like challenge to a wolf, but with an unambiguous certainty, his boots planting firmly in the mud, as if he meant to grow roots there. The rifle stayed on his back, his hands were empty, held low and open, one slightly extended toward the wolf in a reminder, the other already turning toward the trapped leg of the fawn. His gaze held the wolf's for a moment, and in that look there was a complicated mixture of things the animal could not have named, but could feel pressing against his skin respect and expectation, and something like a quiet plea that carried more weight than any leash. Not this one, the man said, his voice softer now but no less firm. Back. The wolf's ears flattened briefly, his lips twitching with the effort of holding back the snarl trying to rise, not at the man, but at the frustration of stilled momentum. His tail flicked, then stilled. The muscles along his sides bunched and released in short, restless quivers, and he tasted his own confusion like a strange, bitter tang under the rich, seductive veil of blood. He knew the man could kill, he had smelled it on him, seen the carcasses brought in from lines and traps, watched the efficient, unemotional way the knife moved through hide and flesh, and somewhere in his mind, new rules had begun to form about when killing happened. And when it did not, rules that were far more complicated than the forest's simple calculus of hunger and opportunity. He paced a small, tight circle just beyond the man's reach, nostrils flaring, his eyes flicking from the fawn's trembling flank to the man's steady hands as they moved toward the trapped leg. The human crouched in the muddy snow without hesitation, his knees soaking through, his breath clouding around his face, and he reached out to touch the fawn's slick hide with deliberate gentleness, murmuring low, meaningless sounds that nevertheless altered the animal's wild, wide-eyed panic by a fraction. The fawn's ears flicked toward the voice, its breathing hitched, then steadied a little, and as the man examined the angle of the leg and the depth of the cut, he kept up the soft stream of sound, as if stitching the air between them with something less crude than force. The wolf watched, his head tilted, his breathing gradually slowing from the rapid pant of the almost hunt to something closer to rest. Every instinct he owned told him that the weak died so the strong could live, that hesitation in the presence of easy prey was a luxury the world did not permit. Yet the winter in the cabin had already taught him that there existed, in this man's orbit, other luxuries: fire you did not have to steal, meat you did not have to run down, shelter from storms you had not earned by tearing another creature's life away. Those gifts had tangled themselves into his bones in ways he had not consciously agreed to, and now, watching the man slight, his hands carefully under the fawn's leg, bracing it, twisting subtly to free it from the trap of rocks, he felt those tangled lines pull against the old, straight ones with growing insistence. When the leg came free, the fawn lurched, trying to bolt on pure terror and adrenaline, but the damaged limb buckled immediately, and it nearly went down. The man tightened his grip, not enough to hurt, just enough to steady, his shoulder muscles standing out under his jacket with the strain of holding wild weight that did not understand the difference between harm and help. The fawn's heart hammered so hard that the wolf could almost hear it from where he stood. Its eyes rolled again, but this time when they passed over the wolf, there was something new there, something like recognition that another predator was choosing, for reasons it could not comprehend, not to close the distance. The wolf took a slow step backward. He did not retreat all the way to the trail. He stayed close enough that his presence remained part of the scene's geometry, a dark watching shape that the fawn could not ignore, a shadow of the forest's usual rules standing at the edge of a new fragile one. The man noticed the movement, a faint easing in his jawline, the smallest exhale of relief, betrayed his awareness, but he did not look away from the work in front of him, not until he had wrapped a strip of cloth from his own shirt around the worst of the cuts, tying it off with numb, clumsy fingers that left smears of bright blood on the white fabric. When he finally released the fawn and sat back on his heels, the young deer staggered once, twice, then found a precarious balance on 3 good legs and 1 injured one. It stood there, sides heaving, head high, nostrils flaring as it took in the 2 very different predators that flanked its narrow, precarious path to freedom. For a moment the forest held them all in a single suspended frame: mud, water, steam, breath, fur, cloth, and then the fawn did something that made the wolf's skin ripple with the strangeness of it. It took 1 careful step toward him, not toward the man who had freed it, not toward the thicker cover of the willows, but toward the wolf standing in the half-melted snow, his paws dark with mud, his eyes bright with conflicting hunger and something else. It extended its neck slowly, nostrils quivering, and the wolf, in spite of every rule he had ever been born with, did not snap, did not lunge, did not even growl. He stood very still as the fawn's damp, trembling nose touched his muzzle in the lightest, most tentative of contacts, a gesture that should never have existed in any realistic accounting of predator and prey. The touch was brief, gone almost before he registered it, but the sensation warm and delicate and full of a terror that had somehow not entirely drowned out trust sank deep. The fawn pulled back, gave a last shuddering breath, and then turned awkwardly toward the thicker stand of trees, limping but moving under its own power, its white tail flashing once before the underbrush swallowed it. The wolf watched until the sound of its uneven steps faded, until the blood smell thinned into just another strand in the messy braid of forest scents, and then he lowered himself slowly onto his haunches, as if his legs did not quite remember what they were supposed to do now that the hunt had been deliberately abandoned. His stomach clenched with uncomplicated physical emptiness, his mouth still watered faintly. His body did not understand why it had been denied such an easy answer to its needs. Somewhere deeper, though, under the fierce protest of his nerves, a different sensation had begun to spread, a heavy, unfamiliar weight that was not satisfaction and not exactly loss, but something in between, something that felt a little like the aching relief of a wound that had been bound instead of ignored. The man rose, his joints popping softly, and slung the rifle more comfortably across his shoulders. He looked down at the wolf with an expression that contained a quiet pride the animal could not parse, but could feel in the way his voice softened when he spoke, not in babying tones, but in the same matter-of-fact cadence he used when telling Emma how to safely stack kindling. They turned back toward the cabin together, leaving the muddied bank behind, and as they walked, the wolf's thoughts churned as restlessly as the creek, circling around a single stubborn awareness that would not let go. He had released a meal that the winter world would have gladly taken from him, and the sky had not fallen. The forest had not turned against him. The rules had bent, and yet somehow, impossibly, he was still there, still breathing, still walking beside the 2-leg, who seemed determined to carve out a small space where strength meant more than just how quickly you could close your jaws around something weaker than yourself. Spring did not arrive in the forest with any sudden fanfare. It seeped slowly into the bones of things, working its way under bark and snow and skin until even the rocks seemed to sweat with the effort of thawing. The creek below the cabin, which had spent most of the winter muttering under a lid of ice, found its voice again and turned loud and impatient. hurling meltwater down over the stones with a constant restless roar that drifted up through the trees to the yard. The wolf, leaner now and longer in the leg, with the soft clumsiness of puppyhood burned away by months of moving through drifts and brush, paced the fringe where the packed dirt path gave way to pine needles and damp leaves, his head tilted as he listened to the familiar, newly powerful sound. The cabin behind him smelled of wet wool and frying onions and Emma's paint set, which she had dragged out to the table by the window as soon as the light lasted long enough to make it worthwhile in the evenings. Inside, she hummed under her breath while she worked, the tune wobbly and half-remembered, and every so often she would call out through the open window to ask if he was still there, as if the forest might swallow him whole in the time it took her to rinse a brush. He answered her with small movements, the shuffle of paws, the soft chuff she had come to recognize as a scent, yet his attention remained fixed on the invisible lines of the woods beyond, where scents shifted day by day in ways his human family would never fully notice. He had learned over the past months that the forest could hold more than one set of rules at once, that a fawn could limp away under its own frightened strength and still live long enough to learn the shape of fear, rather than simply becoming meat. He had learned that a trap could be sprung by paws and not jaws, and that the world did not end when prey got away. Those lessons had sunk deep, building a strange flexible lattice in his understanding of survival, yet beneath them, older, harder truths remained. Packs moved, territories overlapped, old trails were never completely washed away by new weather. On that morning, when the air carried a particular tightness, a faint electricity that made his fur lie differently along his spine, he knew before he smelled them that something from his first life was creeping back along the edges of his second. The scent reached him as a ghost at first, a tattered fragment carried by a stray gust that had wandered too far from its originating bodies. It slipped between the sharper smells of damp soil and early wildflowers, and for a heartbeat he dismissed it as memory, some trick of his own mind stitching longing into the air. Then it came again, stronger, threaded with urine marks on old trees, with shed hair caught on low branches, with the musky, unmistakable signature of wolves moving with purpose through the undergrowth. His heart snapped into a faster rhythm. His legs, which had been simply pacing, found a new urgency in their movement, and he drifted farther from the cabin's orbit than he usually allowed himself when the man was away checking lines. Emma called his name once, her voice shaded with mild annoyance at being ignored, but he barely registered the sound. The invisible tug in his chest had him now, pulling him down the slope toward the creek in a line that felt both brand new and deeply familiar. He slipped between saplings and around moss-slick stones, his body remembering the pattern of moving alone through a space that had once only meant danger. The collar at his neck was little more than a weight now, a token of the life above. Yet as the sound of the cabin's door closing faded behind him, he felt its presence with every breath, as if it had sunk under his skin. Along with the man's and Emma's smells, he reached the bank of the creek at a place where the water widened and slowed, spreading itself thin and shallow over a rocky bed that glinted with mica in the pale sunlight. The air here was cooler, damp and metallic with the spray, and the noise of the water masked finer sounds until his ears adjusted, filtering the constant rush into a background that let other things slip through. A dragonfly skimmed low over the surface, its iridescent body flickering. A frog plopped from a rock into the dark pool near the far bank. Somewhere overhead, a jay screeched with the self-importance that seemed to be the birthright of its kind. Underneath all of that, breaking through in small, sharp threads, came the breath and movement of another predator. He smelled him before he saw him. The scent hit like a door swinging open, sudden and total, flooding him with information faster than his conscious mind could sort. Male, young but not a pup anymore, strong, with scars under the fur and old bracken clinging to his tail, meat on his breath, fresh, probably rabbit, fierce sweat, sharp and thin, not from immediate danger, but from the complicated awareness of entering a space that might not be his. And under all of that, a deep, Laird note that vibrated along something inside the wolf like a struck string. Blood, shared birth den, shared milk, brother. He froze, his body going so still that the only movement was the slight flare of his nostrils and the slow blink of his eyes as they locked onto the figure stepping out from the low screen of alders on the opposite bank. The other wolf emerged with a caution that lived in the angle of his shoulders and the way his weight shifted from paw to paw, ready to bolt or attack as needed. Yet when he saw the one waiting by the water, his posture changed in a way that ignored all the current politics of territory and focused on history instead. His ears pricked, his mouth opened in what, on a human face, might have been a smile, his tail, which had been held in a neutral line, lifted in an uncertain wag that betrayed more youth than his body now showed. For a long suspended moment they simply looked at each other across the narrow band of water, each taking in the changes time and circumstance had wrought on the other. The cabin wolf saw the new strength in his brother's chest, the way his legs had lengthened into tools meant for distance, the faint notch missing from his right ear, where some winter fight had taken its tax. He saw, too, the way the other's fur lay, thick and unshadowed by the brushed-out sheen of human hands, full of burrs and small knots, that spoke of sleeping in leaf beds and snow hollows instead of on rugs by the fire. The creek wolf, for his part, saw a coat with a strange smoothness, a body carrying the faint foreign scent of wood smoke and laundry soap, scars that were cleaner than the forest usually allowed, a collar that sat around the throat like a question. Recognition broke the stiffness first. The brother on the far bank dropped suddenly into a playbow that could have come straight from their earliest days, stumbling over each other in the cramped den, chest low, front legs stretched forward, hindquarters high, tail waving in a loose, exuberant arc. He gave a short, breathy bark that was more pup than adult, the sound bouncing off the rocks and scattering a small flock of finches from a nearby bush, and his eyes brightened with that uncomplicated joy that only creatures without the burden of language truly understand. The cabin wolf felt his own body answer almost without permission, his muscles remembering the precise shape of that game, the way his mother had sighed and pretended not to watch as they tumbled and bit and rolled, testing each other's limits and learning, through bruises and licks, what it meant to belong. He launched himself into the shallows with a splash that sent icy droplets up onto his chest and belly, the shock of the cold threading through his excitement but not slowing it. The creek was only knee-deep here, its bottom uneven with rocks, yet he found his footing easily and made the crossing in 3 quick strides, the current tugging at his fur but failing to turn him. On the other side, his brother met him head-on, not with bared teeth and stiff hackles, but with a full body lean that knocked them both sideways into the damp leaf-strewn mud. For several wild heartbeats, they were nothing but a tangle of fur and limbs and old, half-forgotten moves, jaws snapping near ears and noses, paws drumming against ribs, throats exposed, and then covered again in a dance that never tipped fully into real aggression. They smelled each other in those rolling seconds more completely than any calm greeting could have allowed. The cabin wolf inhaled the pack's complex identity off his brother's neck, the sharp overlay of other males, the softer, deeper note of an older female who might have been a new mate for one of the leaders, the faint trace of pups that were not from their litter but shared their bloodline somewhere farther up the tree, and under all of that, the echo of his own scent. Faded but not erased, clinging to the other's fur from that shared winter den and the weeks before the bear. The creek wolf, in turn, caught the ghost of human hands in his brother's coat, the peculiar sterile sting of antiseptic near the healed scar, the comforting steady undertone of the man's presence, and Emma's sugar and paper smell woven into the base note of pine and dirt. They broke apart eventually, tongues lolling, sides heaving, and stood facing each other with damp fur and damp earth under their claws, the playful chaos settling into a more complicated stillness. The brother tilted his head, his gaze flicking to the collar, and then back to the cabin wolf's eyes, and something in his own eyes cooled by a few degrees, curiosity shading into something more guarded. He stepped closer, nose working, and sniffed deliberately at the leather, at the metal ring that glinted faintly in the filtered light, then followed the line of scent up along the jaw to the ears, where he could smell Emma's fingers and the man's calloused palms as clearly as if they were present. The low questioning whine that came from his throat carried layers the cabin wolf could feel, even if he could not translate them neatly. Where have you been? Why do you smell like them? What did you trade to still be alive when the den is gone? The cabin wolf shifted his weight, suddenly aware of every trace of his life above the slope. Clinging to his skin-like burrs, he could not shake, aware, too, of the absence of certain scents on his brother. That he had loved their mother's musk, the distinctive tang of the runt who had always slept pressed against his side. Both missing now in a way that made the empty spaces between the trees feel larger. He answered with his body as best he could. He lowered his head in something that was not submission but acknowledgement, a gentle bump of his forehead against his brother's shoulder that carried apology and grief and stubborn quiet pride in the same motion. He stepped slightly to one side so the wind blew across him and toward the creek, allowing his brother a clearer reading of the man's and Emma's smell on him, not hiding what he had become, even as part of him wished he could. His brother sneezed once, a reflexive little burst at the strength of the foreign scents, and then gave a small dismissive huff that was not entirely convincing. He turned his head toward the deeper forest, ears pricking, and in that angle the cabin wolf saw the pull of the pack in him, the constant awareness of where they were, what direction they had taken, how far they had ranged. A short bark, half exhortation and half command, left his mouth. He took 2 steps uphill, then stopped and looked back. His whole posture and invitation shouted in a language without words, "Come, we are moving, fall in, remember what you are." The cabin wolf's muscles reacted before his mind could, his body aligning itself automatically along that vector toward the old world. His paws knew how to fall into that rhythm. His lungs knew how to match pace with another. His heart knew how to settle into the comfort of not being alone in the world's vast and different winter. He could picture it in a flood of remembered images, the sweep of the valley when seen from the high ridge, the reek of elk on the wind, the chorus of howls that rose in the blue hour before dawn as a single living thing. Behind him, though, down the slope and around the bend of the trail, the cabin he could not see still existed, full of objects and smells and voices that had carved their own channels through his being. He thought of Emma's unsteady handwriting on the papers she sometimes crumpled and tossed toward the trash, only to have him fish them out and chew them until she laughed and scolded him gently. He thought of the man's heavy hand resting between his shoulders after a long day on the lines, the heat of the stove at his side, the absurd tender weight of the pillow Emma had stuffed with his shed fur as a joke and then slept on anyway. Those images layered themselves over the picture of the pack in a way that made neither entirely clear and the overlap almost painful. His brother seemed to sense the hesitation without needing to understand its cause. The easy boyish playfulness had drained from his posture, leaving a warier, more adult set to his shoulders and neck, and when he stepped closer again, his nose went not to the collar this time, but straight to the wolf's chest, pressing against the fur just above his heart, as if trying to scent what lay underneath bone and muscle. When he sat back, the disappointment in his eyes was not sharp and accusing as it might have been from a leader, but it carried a sting nonetheless, the hurt of someone who feels abandoned, but does not yet have the language to craft an indictment. The sound he made then was soft and cutting, a small, almost careless exhale that seemed to say, "You smell like them now. You sleep where they sleep. You are not one of us anymore." It was not a formal banishment. Wolves did not operate on such ceremonial terms. It was worse in some ways because it came as a simple statement of fact, an observation as impersonal as the weather yet loaded with personal loss. The cabin wolf flinched. He had known, in a scattered, unfocused way, that the life he had built on the slope put him at an angle to the old life in the valley, that he straddled a line others did not, but hearing that line drawn so cleanly, even in wordless sound, cracked something inside him that had been under tension for a long time. He huffed back a rough layered noise that carried defiance and sorrow and a stubborn refusal to fully relinquish either world, and for a moment they stood nose to nose, close enough to feel each other's breath, brothers in form and blood and memory, who no longer shared a single understanding of what their shapes meant. Then the forest shifted subtly around them. Far off, beyond the next ridge, a deeper voice called, the kind that made smaller creatures freeze mid-step and birds go suddenly silent on their branches. The pack was moving again, the alpha had summoned, and the brother's body responded with the same automatic obedience the cabin wolves had felt when the man's sharp command had cut through the urge to kill at the creek. His ears flicked in that direction, his tail gave one brief conflicted twitch, and he made a small circle on the spot, as if testing whether his paws might choose for him. When he looked back one last time, there was something in his eyes that had not been there at the start, not acceptance, not exactly, but a grudging, puzzled acknowledgement that his brother now inhabited a space he could not follow into. He brushed past him once more, their shoulders touching, a fleeting contact that stole some of the bite from his earlier judgment, and then he turned and loped up the slope, his body stretching into the easy ground-eating stride of a wolf falling back into his pack's orbit. The cabin wolf watched him go until the trees swallowed the last glimpse of his tail, his own paws rooted to the damp earth by a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. The water beside him chattered on over its stones. Indifferent, a squirrel scolded somewhere overhead. Offended by their brief intrusion, the world, which had seemed to contract around the electricity of reunion, now expanded again in all directions, leaving him standing alone on the bank with two sets of scents on his fur and no clear answer to which one defined him. When he finally turned back toward the cabin, climbing the familiar path with slow measured steps, the smell of wood smoke reaching down to meet him before the roof came into view, he carried with him the memory of his brother's eyes, and that simple, devastating implied question, if you are no longer fully ours and not entirely theirs, who are you? Winter came back harder than anyone in the cabin wanted to believe it could, slamming down over the forest after a week of soft-lying thaws that had tricked even the oldest trees into loosening their grip on sleep. One morning, the yard had been a wet, patchy mess of mud and slush, the air smelling of rot and cold water. The next, the world was glass again, every twig encased in ice, every footprint erased under a new ruthless crust of snow that glittered under a sky so pale it hurt to look at it. Emma stood at the window with her chin on the back of a chair and groaned that it wasn't fair, while the man muttered something about false springs and idiots in town who would drive too fast on black ice, and the wolf, now fully grown in his body, though not yet in whatever passed for his mind, felt a strange mixture of irritation and relief slight under his fur. The cold sharpened everything. Scents that had been mushy and indistinct in the brief thaw drew tight and clear again, each breath bringing crisp, separate notes of wood smoke, frozen sap, old urine marks, and the faint animal tang of bodies that were moving more than they wanted to, forced into motion by empty bellies. In that hard air, his own hunger stood out like a bone under skin, a constant gnawing presence that did not care about lessons or callers or nights by the fire. It cared only about the simple fact that the last rabbit Emma had sneaked him from the stew pot, had been 2 days ago, and that the scraps from the man's plate did not fill a ribsage built to run for miles after fleeing meat. He had begun, with the man's grudging approval, to range farther on his own when the weather allowed small arcs away from the cabin that always, so far, came back to the same door, the same porch, the same warm hand on his head. The man had shown him lines and traps, had let him watch as metal jaws were baited and set, had scolded him sharply when he tried to nose too close, drilling a rough human version of the forest's own hard rules into him. This is mine, that is not for you. You do not take what another has laid claim to lest you find your paw where the rabbit's neck was meant to be. Those lessons had tangled with the older ones from his mother until his world sometimes felt like two overlapping sets of invisible fences, human and wild, both ready to bite if he stepped in the wrong place. On the morning it happened, the sky was a brittle blue that promised no mercy from the cold, and the snow under his paws squeaked with that particular dry noise it only made when the temperature hung low even at midday. He had eaten almost nothing since dawn, a few frozen berries dug from under a bush, the ragged remains of a squirrel some other predator had half forgotten. They sat in his stomach like insults rather than food. The man had gone out early, his breath rolling thick from his scarf, as he headed toward the ridge to check traps set farther than the wolf usually wandered. And Emma had been left at the table with her workbook and a mug of cocoa, her feet wrapped in an extra pair of thick socks, her concentration already fraying toward the window where he had stood with his paws on the sill, restless. When the man opened the door to the cold and the smell of the forest flooded in, the wolf had followed him without being called, slipping through the gap like a gray shadow and trotting a few paces ahead on the path. The man had hesitated, then shrugged the small helpless shrug of someone who knows there is only so much keeping another creature can bear, and had let him go with a single low instruction that hung like a bell in the wolf's ears, even after the sounds of boots on snow had faded behind him. Be smart. He moved through the trees with a pace that sat somewhere between a trot and a lope, not the full joy-drunk sprint of a pup discovering his legs, but a purposeful energy-saving gait that ate distance, while leaving enough in the muscles for a fight or a chase if opportunity presented itself. The forest in this returning Cold War a different face than it had at the Fawn's Creek. The softness of thawed mud was gone, replaced by the treacherous firmness of ice hidden under a dusting of new powder. The quiet blanket of snow broken here and there by the stark, ugly signs of hardship, a crow-punctured carcass picked almost clean, vomit frozen into a rough, sour-smelling lump where some animal's stomach had refused its last desperate meal. He smelled the rabbit before he heard it, and he heard it before he saw it. The scent came ahead of him on the still air, thin but vivid, the small sharp musk of fierce sweat, wrapped around the weak grassy note of a body that had been eating bark and twigs instead of good summer greens. It pulled at him low in his belly, the memory of softer seasons winding through the present ache, and he slowed instinctively, his paws placing themselves with more care, his weight shifting closer to the ground. A few strides later, a faint, frantic thrashing sound reached his ears, muted by the snow, but unmistakable claws scrabbling uselessly against a hard surface, the staccato thump of a small body hitting metal, the sharp, wet rasp of fast, panic breath. He crept closer, each step a small argument between his hunger and the human-learned wariness about man-made sounds in the wild. When the trees thinned and he saw the small clearing ahead, his eyes picked out the trap before they registered the rabbit, not because it was large or obvious, but because the shape of it had been burned into his mind months ago, in the soft glow of the cabin's lamp, while the man explained, half to Emma, half to him, the way its jaws snapped and held. It sat just off a game trail, half buried in old snow and new fluff, its ring of metal almost beautiful in its brutal simplicity, teeth closed around a small struggling hind leg. The rabbit's fur, once white enough to vanish into the drifts, was dirty and matted with blood where the steel had cut. Its eyes bulged, reflecting the cold sky in tiny blue ovals, and its body jerked with a kind of exhausted desperation that had no rhythm left in it. It smelled like life on the edge of giving up, that sharp, peculiar flavor of a creature that has run out of real options and is cycling through the last frantic electrical storms of its nerves. The wolf's mouth flooded with saliva, his throat tightening reflexively in anticipation of a bite, even as another part of him recoiled from the trap itself. The metal reeked of old rust and human touch, of oil and the ghost of other animals that had died there, stacked one on top of another in some invisible ledger that did not care whether he added his own act to its tally or not. He stood with his paws at the edge of the clearing, every muscle in his body taut, and stared at that writhing, easy meal caught in a ring of dangers, he understood with a clarity that went beyond instinct. He could ignore the trap. That was the first option his mother would have pushed into his bones if she had been standing beside him, the wild, simple caution about strange, shiny things that smelled like man in pain. Leave it, pups. Not worth the risk. There are other rabbits, other days. He could lunge, trusting to speed and angle and luck to snatch the soft, vulnerable body out of the steel teeth without getting caught himself. A maneuver his growing experience told him was possible, but far from guaranteed, especially with the snow hiding the exact shape of the jaws. Or he could back away, circle, pretend he had never seen this impossible collision of everything he was and everything he had learned, and spend the rest of the day chasing shadows, while this rabbit bled and trembled, and finally went still within earshot of his conscience. Somewhere under those three, like a trap under snow, lay the fourth option, the one the man had shown him with the fawn, the one that had left his stomach empty and his mind disturbingly full. He stepped forward. The rabbit froze at his approach, its eyes going even wider, its breath stopping for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch the length of the clearing. Its body pressed down as far as the metal allowed, trying to make itself smaller, to disappear into the snow, its ears flattened, and a thin keening sound crept out of its throat, so quiet that a human would never have heard it over the harsh, dry whisper of the winter wind. The wolf's shadow fell over it like a second softer trap, his body blocking what little warmth there was from the pale sun, and he stood above it for a long moment, his own breath steaming around his face, his eyes on the chain that led from the trap's jaws to the stake driven into the frozen ground. He remembered the man's hands again, the way they had moved with the stick at the fawn's creek, careful and sure, angling for leverage instead of violence. He did not have hands. He had paws and teeth, tools designed to tear and crush, not to pry delicate mechanisms open without triggering them. Yet he had watched enough, both in the forest and by the fire, to know that metal, like bone and wood, had its own logic of pressure and angle. He lowered his head, the collar's edge pressing briefly into the back of his neck, and nudged at the ring with the side of his muzzle, testing. The cold bit through the thin fur there, making his skin flinch, and for a moment instinct screamed at him to recoil, to stop putting his face so close to something that designed itself to clamp down. He ignored it. Slowly, awkwardly, he shifted his weight and placed his front paws on either side of the trap, feeling for the solid parts under the snow, the pieces that did not move, the way he had felt for firm ground under the creek's icy crust. He pressed down, hard, not on the jaws themselves, but on the flat springs at their sides, remembering how the man had braced them with a stick, how the metal had resisted, then yielded. At first nothing happened. The trap sat stubbornly under his weight, the rabbit's leg still held fast, its breath coming faster again as the proximity of teeth and failure frayed whatever thin strand of hope it had left. The wolf shifted his stance, claws digging for better purchase on the crusted surface, his muscles bunching and unbunching in small controlled surges, and tried again, this time timing his downward push with a short exhale, that tight in every fiber from shoulder to paw. The springs creaked. It was a tiny, almost beneath hearing sound, but in the taut stillness of the clearing, it might as well have been a gunshot. The jaws eased a fraction, not enough to free the rabbit, but enough to change the pitch of its next whimper, enough to prove that the trap could be persuaded to open, rather than simply forced to break. Encouraged, the wolf bore down harder, feeling the strain ripple through his own body, as if he were wrestling another animal instead of inanimate steel, his hindquarters braced, his tail stretched straight for balance. Slowly, grudgingly, the jaws parted. The rabbit screamed then, a raw high noise ripped from somewhere beyond conscious control as its crushed legs slipped free and blood surged back into the mangled flesh. It tried to bolt, instinct flinging it forward in a blind, desperate leap that sent it crashing straight into the wolf's chest, its small skull thudding against his sternum. The contact jolted them both. The trap, suddenly unloaded, snapped shut behind them with a vicious clang that sent up a spray of snow and a sting of metal smell, a reminder of how close his paws had come to being where the rabbit's leg had been. For a heartbeat they remained pressed together, predator and prey locked not by violence but by accident, the rabbit's fur icy and clumped against his chest, its heart hammering so hard could feel each beat through his own ribs. Its scent, up close, was a flood of contradictions, raw terror, old hunger, the simple, unadorned animal will to live that mirrored his own, so clearly it made something in him twist. His jaws were right there. He could drop his head, open his mouth, and close his teeth around the fragile column of its neck before it even registered the shift, end its fear and his hunger in one efficient ancient motion. The forest outside this clearing, the wolves on the ridge, the foxes and owls and bobcats and men with guns would have approved this was how winter debts were paid, how bodies were kept in motion. The lessons of the cabin, of the fawn, of the man's low proud murmur when he had turned away from easy meat, pressed against that truth with equal force. He stepped back. The movement broke the accidental embrace and left a small rabbit-shaped hole in the snow between them. The freed animal staggered, its injured leg dragging, staining the crust with a bright smear that would shout its passage to any nose for hours. It looked up at him for a fraction of a second, eyes black and depthless, something like comprehension flickering there in a way that was almost more than he could bear, and then it lurched toward the cover of a fallen log, vanishing under its shadow with the clumsy, frantic determination of the almost dead. The clearing felt suddenly enormous. The trap lay behind him, its jaws closed again on nothing, the metal faintly marred where his claws had dug in. The snow bore the marks of their struggle, overlapping tracks and red streaks, and the deep indent where his weight had driven down on the springs. The air still rang with the echo of the rabbit's scream and the thick quiet that followed it, the kind of silence that feels aware. His chest heaved, his stomach clenched and protested, his tongue ran over teeth that had not closed on anything more substantial than cold air. He turned toward the path back to the cabin, his paws moving with an odd heaviness, as if each step had to be considered and agreed upon by more than one voice inside him. Hunger stalked at his side like a shadow. Behind it walked something else, slower, heavier, not quite pride and not quite regret, but a complicated presence that made his skin feel too tight and his collar too noticeable against his throat. When he pushed the cabin door open with his shoulder a little while later, snowmelt soaking into the fur between his toes, the warm air that met him was thick with the smell of meat. The man stood at the counter with a slab of venison on the cutting board, knife already in hand, his cheeks raw and red from the wind, his eyes narrowing automatically as he glanced toward the door to see what sort of trouble the wolf might have dragged in. For a second, the human's gaze flicked past him, searching for mud, blood, feathers, some sign of mischief or success, and when it found nothing but a lean, tired animal with damp fur and a strange, unsettled light in his eyes, something like understanding moved through his features. He reached for a smaller piece of meat set aside near the stove, not a scrap, not a pity bone, but a chunk that would sit solid in a hungry stomach, and tossed it toward the wolf with an easy practiced motion. The wolf caught it midair, his teeth finally sinking into flesh, the taste exploding over his tongue in a rush that made his knees briefly weak. The meat was not his kill. It had not been earned by a chase, by blood on snow, by the clean heart satisfaction of risk and reward. It had been earned another way, through a choice that left no visible marks on the landscape, and yet had changed its shape for at least 2 small lives. As he chewed, the sound of the trap snapping in the rabbit's body hitting his chest replayed in his mind, not as a clean moral story with a neat edge, but as a messy, unresolved knot of impulses and consequences. Somewhere in that knot, a thin, clear thread began to glint, faint and new, the awareness that he had not just obeyed a command or mimicked a trick, but had acted on his own as something that was not quite the wolf his mother had raised, and not quite the dog the logging trucks sometimes carried in their cabs. Something in between. Something that could look at a trap in the snow and see more than an easy meal or an easy death. Outside, the winter held its breath a little longer over the forest, ice on every branch, hunger in every hollow. Inside, by the fire, a creature with a collar and wild eyes lay down with a full stomach and a mind that for the first time felt uncomfortably, irreversibly changed. The second winter did not feel like the first one had, even though the snow lay just as deep and the cold was just as unforgiving, because this time the wolf moved through it with a body that knew its own strength, and a mind that could not pretend ignorance about the weight of his choices. The cabin on the slope had weathered storms and thaws with the stubborn endurance of good lumber and constant work. Its roof bore a new patch where the man and Emma had hammered in shingles together, their laughter and curses drifting out into the freezing air, and its inside air held layers of memory, stew, and smoke and wet dog, crayon wax, and coffee. And the faint chemical tang of gun oil wiped carefully from metal. The wolf wore all of those smells in his fur now, along with pine needles and mud, so that wherever he went, the air around him told a story no other animal's scent did. He ranged farther than he used to, his paths extending beyond the familiar creek and ridges into folds of the forest where the trees grew closer, and the snow underfoot hid deadfalls and old traps that he had learned to read as easily as Emma read the warning signs on the highway. The man allowed these wider loops with a wary kind of trust, reinforced by evenings when the wolf would drop onto the rug near the stove and lay his head on his paws in a posture that said he had seen things but could not explain them. Emma grew into her limbs the way he had grown into his long legs and new angles, making her clumsy for a while and then, slowly, graceful, and her voice when she called after him as he loped into the trees carried both teasing and something quieter, a habitual, unspoken please come back that slit under his ribs like an extra bone. On the day the forest turned on him in a new way, the weather itself offered no warning. It was one of those gray, heavy afternoons when the clouds seemed to sit just above the treetops, pressing down on the world with a weight that muffled sound and kept scent low and thick. Snowflakes drifted lazily from a sky the color of old wool, not a storm, but a steady patient fall that promised to erase tracks by nightfall. The wolf moved through it with his usual easy trot, steam puffing from his nostrils, his ears tuned to the small noises that threaded the dull quiet, the distant creak of ice on a lake he could not see, the irregular scuttle of something burrowing under the snow, the faint repetitive tap of a woodpecker far off on a dead trunk. He caught the fox's smell first, a thin, sharp ribbon that wound between the heavier strands of hare and vole and deer. It was a different predator's scent, quick and nervous and edged with the musk of someone who survived more on cleverness than on sheer force, and it carried, today, an undernote that made his own hackles twitch, blood, not from a clean sudden kill, but the smeared ragged aroma of a wound that had been open for more than a few breaths. He followed it without really thinking about why, his paws turning in its direction the way his mind turned toward puzzles, toward things that did not fit the forest's usual equations. The trail led him along a narrow draw where the snow lay deeper, undisturbed by larger bodies, his legs sinking to mid-shin with each step until the cold packed into his fur and clung there. The trees here were older, their branches interlacing overhead to form a kind of vaulted roof that caught and held the falling flakes, so that the light filtered down dim and bluish as if he were underwater. The fox's scent grew stronger as he went, the blood element thickening until it felt like a taste on his tongue, metallic and hot, even in the frigid air. Under it, faint but there, lay another familiar signature he had not smelled this close in months, his brother, and behind him, like a chord supporting a melody, the rest of the pack. He slowed, instinct dropping his body closer to the snow without conscious command, his tail lowering, his ears adjusting in tiny, precise angles. The draw curved left, then right, and when he eased his head around the last bend, The scene opened in front of him with a clarity that made his heart give a strange, hard double beat in his chest. The fox lay half on its side in the churned-up snow near a fallen log, its red coat a shock of color against the white, darkened in patches where blood had soaked through. One of its hind legs was bent wrong, the joint swollen and slick with frozen gore, and the fur along its flank had been ripped away in ragged strips that exposed pink wet skin to the air. Its chest rose and fell too fast, each breath shallow and rasping, and its eyes, a bright wary amber in better days, now had the wide glassy stare of a creature clinging to consciousness on sheer stubbornness. A smear of pink tracked away from it toward a stand of young spruce, where the snow told the story plainly in scuff tracks and red specks. It had run until it could not run any more. Surrounding it in a loose half-ring stood 3 wolves. His brother was closest, his dark fur dusted with snow, his shoulders tense, his weight balanced forward, every line of his body oriented toward the fox, with the unambiguous focus of a predator who sees the end of a hard hunger within reach. On either side of him, 2 other pack members held positions that mirrored his not as close, not as invested, but equally ready to move when the moment came, their breath curls rising in uneven time, their ears flicking to track the injured animal's smallest motions. Behind and slightly above them, on a small rise, the alpha watched, an older male with a graying muzzle and a scar that dragged one ear down at the tip, his stance casual, almost bored, yet his eyes sharp and bright, taking in every angle of the developing situation, as if he were weighing not just the kill, but the behavior of those making it. The fox's ears flicked when the cabin wolf's scent reached it, its gaze dragging sluggishly away from the immediate threat of teeth in front of it to this new gray shape at the bend. For a heartbeat, the amber eyes held his recognition flaring there, not in the sense of knowing him, but in the sense of knowing his kind, knowing what this silhouette, this smell, this low, rolling gait meant in every story the forest told small creatures about how they died. The fox did not plead. If there was a language for begging between prey and predator, it did not speak it. It only watched him, its head a fraction raised, the muscles around its eyes tight with a pain it had no way to run from anymore. His brother noticed him next. The younger male's head snapped around, nostrils flaring, his jaw tightening as he took in the newcomer's scent and posture in a single swift assessment. For an instant his expression lit up with something like the old den play, the easy joy of seeing a littermate appear, but it twisted almost immediately into something harder when the human smell on the cabin wolf's fur hit him, thick and undeniable even under snow and pine. His tail gave one uncertain twitch, then settled lower than it had been, a subtle sign of the confusion between familial bond and social status, pack hierarchy pressing against blood. The cabin wolf stepped into the open. He did not lunge, did not drop into a crouch, did not bare his teeth, not yet. He walked forward with measured, deliberate steps, his body tall but not puffed, his tail neutral, his ears forward but not aggressively so. The snow squeaked under his weight, the sound startling a few loose flakes from the branches above, and all 3 wolves refocused on him, the air thickening with a new tension that had nothing to do with the fox's labored breathing. The alpha's head lifted a fraction higher on the rise, interest sharpening, while the subordinate at the far end of the half-ring shifted his paws, the faintest hint of uncertainty sliding into his stance. His brother gave a low growl, not a full-throated challenge, but a warning, a terse sound meant to say this is ours, this is our hunger, this is our law, do not interfere. It vibrated through the cold air, through the cabin wolf's chest, through the broken silence of the draw, and the fox flinched involuntarily, its claws flexing weakly in the snow. Somewhere behind the immediate present, a flicker of memory surfaced his brother's earlier snort by the creek, the contempt-threaded observation about human scent, and lost wolfness and layered itself over the current growl, deepening its bite. He smelled the fox again, really smelled it this time, letting the scent roll over him in full, rather than as a background note behind pack musk and snow. Pain, old and new, threaded through every hair, Infection had begun to set in around the leg, a sweet rotten edge to the blood smell that told him this animal, even if left alone now, would not run far or fast again. It was prey in every sense weak, isolated, slowing the herd of its own kind. If it had won, the forest, brutal arithmetic would not mark its loss as tragedy, merely as adjustment. His stomach clenched at the scent of exposed meat, his mouth filling with saliva, his pulse slamming in his throat, with the frustrated echo of the rabbit and the fawn, and every other near miss of easy mead he had walked away from. He stepped between the fox and the pack. The motion was not dramatic. He did not leap, did not throw himself. He simply altered his path by a few degrees, so that his body came to rest squarely in the line between their jaws and its thin beaten flank. His paws planting in the churned snow, his weight settling low, so that he took up more space without needing to puff his fur. The fox blinked, its eyes clouding with confusion as one death shape replaced another in its immediate field of view, and a silence fell that seemed to stretch the forest itself, pulling every twig and pine needle into a held breath. His brother snarled, full and loud this time, the sound tearing from his throat with a raw edge that surprised even him, the kind of growl wolves reserved for serious violations, a subordinate ignoring a clear order, an outsider crossing a boundary with teeth bared. The hair along his spine stood up, his tail lifted, his lips peeled back to show white teeth stained faintly with whatever he had last killed, and his body swung around to face the cabin wolf directly, abandoning the fox in his focus. The subordinate at his side echoed the posture with less conviction, his eyes darting between the two brothers, while the alpha remained still on his small rise, his attention moving not to the fox, but to the way his younger wolves were aligning themselves. The cabin wolf's own lips curled back in answer, almost of their own accord, his jaws parting in a slow, deliberate bearing of his own weapons, that had nothing to do with hunting now, and everything to do with drawing a line that everyone present could see. He did not snarl loudly. His answer came out as a low, steady rumble that sat under the air like distant thunder, the kind of sound that animals hear in their bones. His tail lifted a fraction, not enough to challenge the alpha's position, but enough to say, "I do not roll over here, not on this." His brother's surprise flared in his eyes, quickly smothered under the anger that filled its place. Between them stood a history of shared fights that had always ended with one shoving the other into the dirt, and then laughing as they tumbled, a hierarchy fluid and playful. This was different. This was a stand taken not over a scrap of food or a place by their mother's flank, but over something that cut to the core of what it meant to be wolf, to obey pack law that said the weak are food and those who hesitate go hungry. They moved at almost the same time. The younger brother lunged first, the draw of his muscles telegraphed in the smallest shift of weight, then exploding into a blur of gray and white in sudden terrifying speed. His aim was not the cabin wolf's throat. This was not yet a kill attempt, but his shoulder, the hard driving blow meant to knock him aside, to reassert the natural order with teeth and momentum. The cabin wolf, braced and watching, twisted just enough that the impact slit along his ribs instead of directly into them, pain flaring hot where teeth raked through fur and skin, the taste of his own blood blooming in his mouth, where he bit his tongue with the effort. They crashed into each other in a tangle that sent snow flying, the fox forgotten for a moment, except as a quivering presence at the fringe of their battle. Claws tore at pack drifts, jaws snapped inches from ears and eyes, bodies slammed together and apart in a staccato rhythm. The subordinate, caught off guard by the sudden escalation, danced anxiously at the edge, his body jerking forward a few inches and then back, instinct pulling him toward the fight, while caution and the alpha still, watching form, held him in place. The cabin wolf learned quickly that the months in the cabin had not dulled his brother's prowess. The other male moved with the fluid, brutal grace of someone who had had to fight for food and rank and the right to breed, his body a map of that hard life in scars and corded muscle. Yet the cabin wolf also discovered that he himself had changed in ways that mattered in a fight, the man's rough play, the sled pulling, the pushing and being pushed without lethal intent, had taught him an economy of balance and leverage that he now used without thought, turning some of his brother's more straightforward charges into glancing blows, using the uneven churn of the snow to shift weight under paws at the last second. Teeth found flesh anyway. A bite landed solid on his foreleg, the pressure crushing down until his vision sparked with white pain, and he responded with a snap that connected with his brother's shoulder, the skin giving under his teeth in a hot startling burst that filled his mouth with his own family's blood. The taste shocked him, cutting through the battle haze for a moment. He flinched, not physically, but somewhere inside, and in that brief internal recoil his brother drove forward again, their bodies slamming together hard enough that they both lost their footing and went down in a twisting, snarling heap. They separated when a new sound cut through their private war, not a bark, not a growl, but a sharp, commanding rumble from the Alpha, halfway between thunder and a snapped branch. It carried authority that neither of them could ignore without tearing holes in the very fabric of what made a pack a pack. Both younger wolves froze mid-motion, chest heaving, sides streaked with saliva and blood, their paws braced in the torn snow, their eyes still locked on each other, even as their ears swiveled toward the source of that single unambiguous sound. The Alpha stepped down from his rise. He moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who did not need to prove his strength in every gesture, his tail held level, his head high, his gaze cool and assessing. He walked past the fox without looking at it, though he could not have failed to smell the hot ragged scent of its wound, and came to stand a few paces from the two brothers, close enough that they could feel the heat radiating off his body in the cold air. His eyes went first to the cabin wolf, taking in the collar, the human smell, the defensive position between prey and pack, the blood matting his leg. Then to the younger brother, whose shoulders still shook with adrenaline, whose lips trembled on the verge of another snarl that his brain had not quite decided to suppress. In that moment the draw held a fragile balance. The fox lay in a painful panting heap behind the cabin wolf, its breath frosting the air, its consciousness fraying at the edges, but not yet gone. The subordinate hovered at the perimeter, ears pinned, tail low, ready to follow whichever direction the Alpha's body indicated. The brothers stood locked in a private loop of anger and hurt and stubbornness that the larger social structure had just stepped into. The cabin wolf could feel, almost as a physical thing, the weight of the Alpha's impending decision pressing on his skin, a judgment that would not only settle the question of this fox, but define, in a way no words could, how far one of their own could walk away from old laws and still not be counted an enemy. The Alpha did not rush his judgment, which in its own way was more terrible than an immediate attack would have been, because the longer he stood there, the more clearly everyone present understood that this was not just about a fox on the snow, but about lines being redrawn inside the pack's living map. He walked a slow half-circle around the two younger wolves, his nose testing the air, his paws sinking with soft crunches into the churn drifts, his tail held at that particular height, which said he was not inviting argument, and would meet it with teeth if it came. When he passed behind the cabin wolf, the human smell hit him full on, thick and undeniable, layered over the wild's honest musk, and his lips lifted slightly in a bare, brief showing of teeth that had less to do with immediate aggression than with distaste at the confusion of signals. The cabin wolf held still, feeling that hot breath on the back of his neck like a brand, every instinct trained since birth, telling him to flatten himself, to lick at the air near the Alpha's jaw, to make himself small and harmless until the tension passed. He did none of that. He lowered his head to a respectful level, not challenging the older male's height, but kept his body where it was between the fox and the pack, his paws planted, his muzzles tight in a way that dared the world to see how far he would bend before something in him broke. His brother watched this with something like horror and fascination tangled together in his eyes, because he had always known that his littermate walked a strange path now, smelling like smoke and soap and steel, but seeing him stand almost on equal lines with the alpha in defense of prey crossed a line that no story told at the den's mouth had ever prepared him for. The subordinate shifted uneasily again, the whites of his eyes showing in quick flashes as he looked from one face to another, the fox's labored wheezing breaths a grim metronome beneath the high brittle silence. When the alpha finally spoke, it was not in words, but in a series of sounds and gestures that, for wolves, carried the weight of paragraphs. He growled once, deep and resonant, a sound that started somewhere in his chest, and seemed to vibrate through the frozen air into the bones of those listening. It was not a furious sound, not the explosive snarl of immediate violence, but something older, a reminder rumble that said, "I am the one who decides what this pack is, and whom it holds." He then stepped closer to the cabin wolf until their noses were only a few inches apart, their breaths mingling, their eyes locked. In that tight space, he huffed a short, sharp exhale that carried a complicated bundle of meanings. You are mine by blood and custom, you have walked far. You stink of the ones who kill from a distance and wrap your wounds in cloth. Yet you stand firm, and you did not use your teeth against me when I came behind you. The cabin wolf responded without quite choosing his actions, his body falling into a language learned long before humans ever touched him. He dipped his head a fraction lower, his tail dropping slightly, acknowledging the older male's rank, and then held the position instead of collapsing into full submission, showing plainly that he was willing to back down from a direct challenge to leadership, but not from the line he had drawn in front of the fox. His throat remained exposed enough to prove he understood the stakes, his paws remained where they were, refusing to yield the ground that mattered most. The alpha's gaze slid past him to the fox, whose breath now came in ragged pulls that each produced a faint whistle, its ribs visible under the patchy fur, its body shuddering with cold and shock. The older wolf's nostrils flared, and that breath he took in the same information the cabin wolf had already cataloged infections starting at the ragged wound, weakness woven into the scent of its flesh, the very low odds of its surviving another day, let alone another week. It was not in any real sense useful prey. Killing it would feed one or two stomachs poorly. Leaving it might simply mean some other scavenger taking the small meal, or the forest reclaiming its body piece by piece under the snow. He looked back at the cabin wolf and, with a tiny tilt of his head and the faintest easing of his eyes, made his decision. The rumble that left his chest this time was shorter, clipped, carrying the pattern of command to the others. Leave this one. The pack has bigger hungers to follow. The subordinate's body, which had been poised on the knife edge between joining the brothers' outrage and respecting the alpha's authority, sagged in visible relief. His ears rose a fraction, his tail giving a questioning little wag as he stepped back a pace. The brother, however, stiffened, the fur along his shoulders bristling higher, disbelief and anger climbing inside him like a second hotter fire. He stalked up to the alpha's side, his body low, but his jaw tight, and made a noise that was almost a protest, a high-strained growl that would have been unthinkable if he had not been half drowned in the confusion of watching his reality twist. His eyes flashed to the fox, to the cabin wolf, to his leader's calm face, and in each swing of his gaze the question screamed silently, "How can we turn away? How can we leave meat in the snow when our ribs show and our pups mule in the den?" The alpha flicked an ear toward him, a warning sharp enough to cut, followed by a low specific sound that said clearly, "This is not about meat. Not today. This is about who we let share our breath." Then he did something that no hierarchy chart could have predicted. He stepped past both brothers and walked to the fox's side, his paws landing with unhurried care near its trembling body. The smaller animal's eyes rolled, tracking his approach as far as they could, and its claws scraped weakly against the ice-hard crust, some reflex still trying to pull it away from teeth, even when there was no strength left to flee. The alpha lowered his head, and for a second, every muscle in the jaw tensed, expecting the inevitable closing of jaws, the end of pain and confusion in one decisive bite. Instead, he sniffed along the fox's side, from the torn leg to the heaving ribs to the scruff neck, cataloging every detail. When he straightened, he gave another short carrying bark, this one directed not at his pack mates, but at the space where the forest opened beyond them, a sound that meant go. It was not a word the fox would recognize in content, but the urgency in it, the sharp cutting tone, struck its frayed nerves like a thrown stone. With a convulsive effort, it rolled onto its belly, its injured leg dragging limp and useless, and began to drag itself toward the dark, sheltered tangle of roots and underbrush that promised at least the illusion of safety. Each movement left a smear of blood on the snow, a red trail that would advertise its path to any nose. But in that moment, with the alpha's eyes turned away from it, with the cabin wolf's body still blocking the most direct line of pursuit, it had something no animal in its position had any right to expect a chance. The brother looked as if someone had struck him. His jaw dropped slightly, his breath fogging in quick outraged bursts, his eyes wide with the shock of seeing not only his littermate, but his leader, colluding in this violation of the law he had spent his life obeying. He made a choked noise in his throat, half whine, half snarl, and took a step forward, as if to block the fox himself, to restore the order his elders seemed bent on dismantling. The alpha turned on him with a speed that belied his age, his lips peeling back in a silent snarl that carried such concentrated threat that the younger male stopped mid-step, his paws skidding slightly on the pack's surface. The message needed no words. You question me at your own peril. There is a reason behind this you do not yet see. The brother's ears flattened, then rose halfway, torn between defiance and ingrained obedience, his tail twitching high, and then dropping under the weight of generations of wolves who had learned, often at the cost of their throats, that challenging an alpha head-on was a quick route out of the gene pool. The cabin wolf watched all this with a heart pounding almost as hard as it had during the fight, because he understood with a new cutting clarity that the older male's choice was not simply mercy, it was also a kind of test. By sparing the fox in front of the whole small gathering, by doing so after his own subordinate had expressed hunger and anger, the alpha was stretching the boundaries of what it meant to be part of this pack, seeing whether the fragile structure could accommodate a member who carried foreign scents in foreign ways without shattering. When, at last, the fox disappeared into the root tangle, its red tail vanishing into darkness, the alpha turned back to the three wolves and took a slow, deliberate step toward the cabin wolf. He closed the distance until their shoulders almost brushed, then lifted his muzzle and drew in a long breath near the collar, tasting the human life woven into the fur there. His eyes, when they met the younger male's, held a complicated mixture of resignation and something like reluctant respect. He bumped his forehead once, lightly, against the cabin wolf's head, not the firm, repeated shove of dominance, but a brief, almost ceremonial contact, an acknowledgement that said you are not what you were, yet you stand and you bleed, and you do not flee your choices. Then he stepped away. In that stepping away there was a shift, small enough that a human watching might not have seen it, but immense by the laws that govern their kind. He did not turn his back fully, he was not a fool, but he moved past the cabin wolf without the wary sidelong glance one gives an untrusted stranger, treating him instead as one treats a difficult relative whose strangeness has been noted and accepted as part of the family's new shape. To the subordinate, this was a clear signal: this one is not to be driven off, not yet, perhaps not ever. To the brother, it was a blow that landed deeper than any bite could have. The younger male's gaze burned as the alpha passed him, his body vibrating with the effort of swallowing down the howl that wanted to explode from his chest. He stood there in the half-trampled snow, ribs heaving, and looked at his littermate with eyes that held not only anger now, but a bewildered, aching question. His voice, when it came, was a raw, broken whine that rose into a low, accusing growl, the sounds tumbling over each other in a pattern that meant you are spared, and you have twisted our Father's rules, and somehow he approves. What does that make me? What does that make us? The cabin wolf had no answer in any language he knew. He could only stand, sore and streaked with red, and meet that look with one of his own that carried apology and stubbornness, and a fierce, quiet conviction that had taken root in him through every night by the fire, every trap sprung, every life spared. He did not try to move toward his brother, he did not lick at his face to soothe, he did not bare his teeth in triumph. He simply held his ground, letting the fact of his choice, and the alpha's reaction to it, speak in the space between them. The subordinate, sensing that the moment of real danger had passed, but that something important had shifted under his paws, shook himself from nose to tail, sending a spray of snow from his coat, and then trotted off a few yards, nose already to the ground in search of fresher, less complicated trails. The alpha followed after a brief pause, his steps measured, his head lifting as he gave a short, rallying bark over his shoulder. That's said enough of this. There are other things to hunt. The day does not wait on your private storms. The brother hesitated for a heartbeat longer that seemed to stretch the length of the draw, then turned away as well, his shoulders stiff, his tail held at an awkward height that betrayed his internal disarray. As he moved past the cabin wolf, he did not brush shoulders this time. He gave him a wide berth, a gap filled with hurt and unresolved questions. Yet he did not bare his teeth again or angle for a cheap bite at an exposed leg. His breath, when it ghosted over the cabin wolf's fur in that passing, carried not hatred, but something more dangerous and more complicated, the reluctant, grudging awareness that his littermate, the strange one who smelled of two worlds, had stood in front of prey and pack and leader and had not been crushed for it. When the sounds of their retreating steps had faded into the soft hush of falling snow and the more distant scattered noises of winter life, the draw seemed to exhale, the trees resettling themselves, loose flakes drifting down from branches rattled by the fight. The cabin wolf remained where he was for a long time, his paws anchored in the torn blood-marked snow, his sides rising and falling slowly now, the adrenaline ebbing to leave behind bruises and a hot steady ache in his bitten foreleg. He turned his head toward the tangle of roots where the fox had vanished, smelling the faint traces of its passage, fear, pain, the thinning thread of a life that might yet unravel before the next dawn. He would never know, most likely, whether it survived the night, whether some other predator's nose had followed the easy trail, whether infection would do what teeth had not. What he did know, with a clarity that made his skin feel too tight, was that he had made a choice in front of the only audience that mattered to his first self, and that choice had not been met with exile or death, but with a complex, precarious acceptance that changed the shape of the path ahead. When he finally turned toward the distant line of trees that marked the direction of the cabin, the snow accepting his weight with soft complaints, he carried new wounds and a stiffness in his gait, but also something less tangible and more enduring. He carried the knowledge that the bridge he was becoming between worlds was not built in a single heroic act, but plank by plank in moments like this, where his teeth could have done one thing and his heart insisted on another, and where the wild itself, through its oldest laws embodied in an alpha stride, had chosen not to break that bridge, at least not today. The night the girl disappeared into the forest began like the kind of evening no one expects trouble from, with the sky a clear brittle dome of stars and the moon carving a pale precise path between the bare branches. The cabin's windows glowed a soft yellow against the encroaching dark, their glass fogged slightly at the corners from the warmth inside, and from the yard the wolf could hear Emma's voice drifting through the thin walls, rising and falling, as she recited something for school that sounded to him like a long winding howl broken into human pieces. The air held that particular edge of early spring cold, not the deep bone cracking chill of midwinter, but a damp insinuating cold that crept under fur and coat alike, bringing with it the smells of thawed mud, wet bark, and the first faint hints of rot waking under the snow. He lay at the edge of the yard with his nose over the boundary where packed dirt turned to pine needles, his body pointed toward the trees, his ears taking in the layered soundscape of the ridge, the creek's constant murmur somewhere below, an owl's soft questioning hoot, the distant low pop of ice shifting on a far-off pond. The pack was not close that night. He could sense them only as a vague knowledge in his bones that they were out beyond the valley, following some trail of their own. The absence sat oddly in him, a quiet space where the tug of their presence usually hummed, and into that space drifted a thin, unfamiliar sound that did not belong to any of the forest's usual voices. It came first as a stuttering echo down the slope, too soft to make out words, but sharp enough in its rhythm to mark it as human, a string of high broken syllables that rose and fell in patterns the animals of the woods rarely produced. It was not the deep matter-of-fact rumble of the man's voice, nor the quick musical cadence of Emma's laughter. It carried a rawness around its edges that set his nerves jangling. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, and the wind, shifting slightly, brought him a scent that snapped him to his feet as cleanly as a gunshot. Human, yes, but not one of his. Not the steady familiar ballast of the man, not the sugar and paper and paint tangle of Emma. This smell was lighter, sharper, threaded with a tang of cheap detergent and the faint stale ghost of car exhaust, and underneath that, thicker and more immediate, the hot acid bite of fierce sweat. There was pine and cold on it, earth and bark and damp wool, but no trace of smoke from this cabin, no overlay of the particular combinations that had come to mean home in his mind. It was a stranger's scent, and it was moving unsteadily through the dark somewhere below. The man heard something too. The wolf could tell from the way the older body tensed inside the cabin, the chair's legs scraping back on the floor, the quick shuffle of boots pulled from near the door. Emma's voice stopped mid-sentence, her heartbeat spiking audibly in his ears, even through the wall, and then the door flew open, spilling a wedge of warm light onto the yard and sending a fresh wave of their smells over him. The man stood in the frame for a half-second, head tilted, listening, his hand already reaching for the flashlight hanging on a nail, when the second, clearer cry floated up, a single word this time, drawn out and cracked in the middle, the universal sound for help in any language. The man swore under his breath and stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. "Stay here," he told Emma, his tone brooking no argument, even as she protested from behind him. And then he snapped off the porch light to give his eyes to the dark, the beam of the flashlight remaining unclicked in his hand, held in reserve. The wolf had already moved, his body sliding silently past the edge of the light's memory, his paws finding the path he had taken countless times down the slope. The man saw the gray-shaped ghost pass and called his name, not in anger now, but in a clipped-tight voice that carried both warning and request. The wolf paused just long enough to meet his gaze in the half-light, catching the complicated worry there for the stranger, for Emma, for him, and in that look between species, something like agreement passed. Then he turned and went down into the trees, his senses opening wide to the night. Away from the cabin, the dark thickened quickly, swallowing the faint glow of the windows, leaving only the cold, clean light of the moon, filtering through branches to sketch pale paths on the forest floor. For a creature built for those conditions, it was no hindrance. His eyes adjusted, pulling details from shadows, his ears stretching out to catch the subtle shift of each sound against the constant background hum of the living woods, his nose reading the air like a book he had always known how to translate. The girl's scent was clearer here, caught on low shrubs where her coat had brushed, ground into the thin crust of snow where her boots had slid. Under the fear and detergent, he smelled the faint sweet note of the cafeteria at a school, the chalk dust, the rubber of basketballs, the wax of crayons. She was young, younger than Emma by a year or two, her body still in that light awkward stage where limbs outgrow understanding. He followed the scent trail around a stand of fir trees and through a narrow gap between rocks where the snow had drifted deeper, his paws leaving clean prints beside the smaller, clumsier ones of the girl. She had wandered off the main trail that led toward town, drawn perhaps by curiosity toward the sound of the creek or a flicker of movement she couldn't identify in the dusk, and now her path looped and doubled on itself in a way that spoke of increasing panic-sharp turns, tracks crossing, footprints stamped in place where she had stood spinning, trying to orient herself in a world that, without a road or a sidewalk, offered no markers she knew. He found her when the last light had bled from the sky and the forest had shifted fully into its night self. The edges of things softened, the spaces between trunks full of possibilities that a human brain, already wired to fear what it could not see clearly, would fill with teeth and claws and stories told to keep children from wandering too far. She sat huddled at the base of a big pine where a fall of old needles made a slightly drier patch on the damp ground, her legs pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, her face buried in the crook of her elbows. Her small backpack lay a few feet away, one strap twisted, the zipper half opened as if she had begun to look for something inside, and then forgotten what it was under the press of fear. Her body shook with silent sobs that had long since used up their voices. Only hitching breaths and small, involuntary whimpers escaped, each one fogging the air briefly before the cold ate it. Her hat was gone, her hair snagged with bits of bark and leaves, and her fingers, where they gripped the fabric of her jeans, were bare and red, the knuckles swollen and raw from grabbing at low branches and, perhaps, at rocks when she slipped. The smell of her fear was almost overwhelming up close, a pungent sour scent that overrode the subtler notes, thickening the air around her like another layer of clothing. The wolf stopped just inside the clearing, the shadows holding him for a moment as he watched her. Every instinct he had for approaching prey told him that a sudden movement would send her bolting, flailing blindly through the trees, and perhaps into something far worse than a small pocket of ground. Every lesson he had learned at the cabin about approaching frightened creatures, Emma, with a scraped knee, a trapped rabbit. The fawn at the creek told him that stillness and presence could sometimes do what words could not. He let his breathing slow, smoothing out the excited edge from the chase, and then he stepped forward with deliberate care, placing each paw where the ground was least likely to crunch or crack. She heard him anyway. In a night forest, the human ear, robbed of much of its visual input, clings to every small noise, and the soft rhythmic padding of his approach, the rustle of his body against low branches, registered as something distinctly other than the background whispers of wind and distant water. Her head jerked up, her eyes wide and reflecting the faint light, so that they flashed briefly, animal-like, in the gloom. For a moment she seemed unable to locate him, turning her head this way and that, the whites of her eyes showing starkly. When his silhouette finally resolved itself against the dark of the trees, he saw the recognition hit, or in stages first just large shape, then 4 legs, then a tail, then the long narrow head with its forward-facing eyes and glinting teeth. Her breath caught. The next inhalation sounded like a gasp that had been cut in half. She did not scream. Perhaps the fear had burned that mechanism out of her already. Her hands flew up to her mouth, fingers pressing against her lips, as if to physically hold in any sound that might get the attention of more monsters, and she shrank back against the tree, trying to push herself into its trunk. In her eyes, for a second, he saw reflected the image of himself as humans like her had been taught it, not the creature who slept on a rug and played fetch with a girl in a yard, but the nightmare version from stories and warning posters at campsites, hungry, savage, drawn to the scent of lost children. He stopped where he was and sat down. The motion was slow and unthreatening, his body folding into itself in a way that made him smaller, less like a rushing force, more like a presence. He kept his head turned slightly to the side, not staring directly into her eyes, because he knew from the cabin that direct gaze from predator to human reads like challenge. He let his tongue loll slightly, a posture that in his world often meant play or at least non-aggression, and he kept his tail low, not tucked in fear, but resting loosely on the ground. The forest settled around them, the owl calling again, a small animal scuttling in the leaf litter a few yards away, the wind pushing a faint wave of colder air through the branches overhead. The girl watched him, her chest rising and falling too fast, her pupils huge in the dim. Her hand crept a few inches away from her mouth, fingers trembling, and one small hoarse whisper escaped, the word fractured by chattering teeth. Please, she said, though whether she meant it for him, for the forest, or for some far-off adult who might still be searching, even she might not have known. He moved one paw forward, then another, in a slow measured crawl that kept his head low. When he was close enough that her scent wrapped fully around him all the human details, the shampoo, the cafeteria residue, the cotton of her clothes, the cheap candy she had eaten earlier, something deep in him answered not as a hunter, but as the creature who had once lain on this same forest floor bleeding and waiting. The one who had smelled like fear and mutt and pain until a two-leg had picked him up and carried him toward heat. He closed the last bit of distance until his nose was almost touching the toe of her shoe, and then he lowered his head all the way, resting his chin lightly on the ground, letting his breath fan over the rough fabric. Up close like this, her panic scent was almost suffocating, but there was another note underneath it too, faint and fragile relief, so small it might have been imagined, sparked by the simple fact that he had not lunged at her throat, the way the worst part of her imagination had promised he would. She didn't reach out to him, not yet, but the rigid line of her shoulders loosened a fraction. Her knees slid down from the tight curl against her chest, her feet planting on the ground, as if some part of her brain was already considering the possibility of standing again. Her eyes dropped from his teeth to his eyes, and then to the worn leather collar around his neck, the metal ring catching what little light there was. In that instant something shifted. Whatever stories she had heard about wolves from screens and whispered adult conversations rarely included animals who wore collars. "You're..." Someone, she whispered, the words barely shaping themselves as steam in the air. "You're not wild." He could not understand the words, but he knew the tone, the way Emma's voice sounded when she realized something important in her homework, or when she found a shape in the clouds that suddenly became a dragon. He lifted his head just enough to meet or gaze fully, holding it steady, letting her see the living, aware mind behind his eyes, not the flat, glassy stare of a threat. His ears pricked forward, then swiveled to the side as a distant, heavier sound reached him, the slow, deliberate breaking of small branches under weight, the muted thump of large paws in slush, the low, almost inaudible huff of a breath drawn through a massive chest. The bear's smell arrived a heartbeat later, thick and musky, and edged with the sour staleness of something that had been denned, and was not pleased at being woken. It came from downslope, toward where the creek bent around a rock outcrop that held winter's chill longer than the rest of the valley, and it carried a jagged edge of irritation and hunger. His body snapped upright, every nerve on alert, his head turning to face the direction of that new danger. The girl followed his gaze automatically. Even though she could not see what he sensed, she couldn't parse the smell or the subtle weight of that sound. But the sudden change in his posture, the way his muscles went from fluid to carved, the way his tail stiffened, told her enough. He had to make a choice quickly, one that required both sets of knowledge he carried, the wilds and the cabins. The bear was not yet close enough to see them through the trees, but its path, if it continued straight, would intersect with where they huddled at the base of the pine. Bears in the season, half starved from winter's sleep and stumbling through the transition between torpor and full wakefulness, were unpredictable, their tempers thin, their sense of threat easily triggered. A lone child sitting on the ground and a lone wolf beside, or could read his competition as annoyance as meat. He rose and stepped to the girl's side, positioning his body between her and the sound, the way he had done between the fox and the pack, but with different scope of stakes. She flinched when his shoulder brushed her arm, then went very still, her hand pressing against his fur without conscious thought, seeking warmth and solidity in the only living thing near that she could touch. Her fingers tangled in the thick coat at his neck, clutching tighter as the bear's smell grew stronger, heavy paws now audible in the wet crunch of old snow and new thaw. He felt her shivering increase, not just from cold, but from the new deeper fear that comes when you know something is wrong without being able to see it. He turned his head and nudged her knee with his muzzle, a firm, insistent push that made or look down at him, even as her eyes tried to cling to the darkness ahead. He stepped away from the tree a few paces, then looked back over his shoulder, ears up, tail moving in a short, urgent flick that, in his language, meant follow. When she didn't move, he stopped where he was and sat down. The motion was slow and unthreatening, his body folding into itself in a way that made him smaller, less like a rushing force, more like a presence. He kept his head turned slightly to the side, not staring directly into her eyes, because he knew from the cabin that direct gaze from predator to human reads like challenge. He let his tongue loll slightly, a posture that in his world often meant play or at least non-aggression, and he kept his tail low, not tucked in fear, but resting loosely on the ground. The forest settled around them, the owl calling again, a small animal scuttling in the leaf litter a few yards away, the wind pushing a faint wave of colder air through the branches overhead. The girl watched him, her chest rising and falling too fast, her pupils huge in the dim. Her hand crept a few inches away from her mouth, fingers trembling, and one small hoarse whisper escaped, the word fractured by chattering teeth. Please, she said, though whether she meant it for him, for the forest, or for some far-off adult who might still be searching, even she might not have known. He moved one paw forward, then another, in a slow-measured crawl that kept his head low. When he was close enough that her scent wrapped fully around him all the human details, the shampoo, the cafeteria residue, the cotton of her clothes, the cheap candy she had eaten earlier, something deep in him answered not as a hunter, but as the creature who had once lain on this same forest floor bleeding and waiting. The one who had smelled like fear and mutt and pain until a two-leg had picked him up and carried him toward heat. He closed the last bit of distance until his nose was almost touching the toe of her shoe, and then he lowered his head all the way, resting his chin lightly on the ground, letting his breath fan over the rough fabric. Up close like this, her panic scent was almost suffocating, but there was another note underneath it too, faint and fragile relief, so small it might have been imagined, sparked by the simple fact that he had not lunged at her throat, the way the worst part of her imagination had promised he would. She didn't reach out to him, not yet, but the rigid line of her shoulders loosened a fraction. Her knees slid down from the tight curl against her chest, her feet planting on the ground, as if some part of her brain was already considering the possibility of standing again. Her eyes dropped from his teeth to his eyes, and then to the worn leather collar around his neck, the metal ring catching what little light there was. In that instant something shifted. Whatever stories she had heard about wolves from screens and whispered adult conversations rarely included animals who wore collars. "You're..." Someone, she whispered, the words barely shaping themselves as steam in the air. "You're not wild." He could not understand the words, but he knew the tone, the way Emma's voice sounded when she realized something important in her homework, or when she found a shape in the clouds that suddenly became a dragon. He lifted his head just enough to meet or gaze fully, holding it steady, letting her see the living, aware mind behind his eyes, not the flat, glassy stare of a threat. His ears pricked forward, then swiveled to the side as a distant, heavier sound reached him, the slow, deliberate breaking of small branches under weight, the muted thump of large paws in slush, the low, almost inaudible huff of a breath drawn through a massive chest. The bear's smell arrived a heartbeat later, thick and musky, and edged with the sour staleness of something that had been denned, and was not pleased at being woken. It came from downslope, toward where the creek bent around a rock outcrop that held winter's chill longer than the rest of the valley, and it carried a jagged edge of irritation and hunger. His body snapped upright, every nerve on alert, his head turning to face the direction of that new danger. The girl followed his gaze automatically. Even though she could not see what he sensed, she couldn't parse the smell or the subtle weight of that sound. But they climbed higher, the slope steepening, the bear's sounds fading a little as it continued along its original line, oblivious to the small drama of prey and guardian, unfolding a few hundred yards away. The air grew colder with altitude, the wind more insistent, tugging at hair and fur, but with the cold came a new smell that hit the girl's memory, even before she could name it, Smoke, wood smoke, the clean, slightly sweet odor of seasoned logs burning in a stove. It wrapped around them like an invisible rope, tugging at some deep piece of her that still believed in living rooms and hallways, and the distance between her and her parents measured in streets, not in dark, pathless miles of trees. Her knees nearly gave out with relief at that scent. Fresh tears burned behind her eyes, less from fear now than from the sudden overwhelming hope that she might actually step back into a world of walls and light. She stumbled, and this time when she went down to one hand, she did not curl back into herself. She pushed, using the wolf's steady, patient presence to haul herself upright again, her breath coming in ragged, disbelieving laughs that she tried to smother, as if making too much noise might spook the reality away. Through the thinning trees ahead, a faint, warm glow began to appear, filtered by trunks and branches, but unmistakable. The shape of the cabin emerged gradually, its angles familiar to the wolf in a way no rock or den had ever been, its chimney breathing out a slow, constant plume of smoke that glowed faintly in the moonlight. On the porch, the man's silhouette stood dark against the window, his shoulders rigid, his head bent slightly forward as he stared into the night, the unused flashlight still in his hand, his whole posture that of someone held in place by tension and responsibility. The girls slowed as they approached the edge of the tree line, suddenly self-conscious, as if the presence of a door and a human figure reactivated rules about not running, about knocking, about explaining yourself. She dropped her hand from the wolf's fur reluctantly, fingers lingering in the thick coat for a moment before falling away, and took a few halting steps on her own, her boots crunching on the last patch of snow between forest and yard. The wolf walked beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost brushed, neither leading nor following now, but matching pace. The man saw them and for a second did not move, the image taking a heartbeat to resolve in his mind the girl, foreign in shape and smell, and the wolf, mud splashed and alert, side by side like some illustration from a story no one had taught him how to read. Then the human was in motion, down the steps, the snow squeaking under his boots, his breath puffing thick in front of his face. He called out, his voice steady but roughened at the edges, and the girl made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and lurched toward him, all the stiffness in her body dissolving at once. She collided with him in a tangle of limbs and code and apology, her words spilling out in a jumbled torrent that neither of them really tried to parse, yet lost, sorry, scared, thank you, and he wrapped his arms around her automatically, his hands moving over her arms and shoulders in a quick practice check for injuries the way he had done with the wolf months ago. Over her head, his eyes met the wolf's, and in that held gaze was a flood of things unsaid: fear, gratitude, a flare of anger at a world that threw children into forests and counted on chance and instinct to bring them back. Emma appeared in the doorway, bare feet on the warm boards, her hair sticking up from where she had been dragging her hands through it in anxious habit, her eyes enormous when she saw the small stranger, and the way the wolf stood a little off to the side, not demanding attention, just present, his chest still heaving slightly, his flanks marked with dirt and a few small scrapes from the hurried climb. The man released the girl enough to steer her gently toward the porch, his hand firm at the small of her back, his voice turning reassuring and brisk as he ushered her inside, promising warmth and a phone call and, later, questions. Before he followed, he stepped back toward the wolf, closing the distance with 2 strides, and dropped one calloused hand onto the thick fur between his ears, in a gesture that landed with more weight than any word he could have spoken. His palm rested there for a long moment, fingers pressing lightly, and his voice, when it came, was very soft, almost too soft for human ears, but perfectly clear to the animal who heard it. Good, he said, the single syllable carrying praise and pride and a kind of awe, and under it, something deeper, acknowledgement of what the wolf had become. Emma, on the threshold, wiped at her nose with the back of her hand and smiled a shaky, luminous smile that crinkled the corners of her red-rimmed eyes, and as the wolf watched the girl he had brought disappear into the square of light, swallowed by warmth and human voices. He felt the forest at his back and the cabin before him, both pressing gently, no longer as opposing forces, but as parts of a whole that, for the first time, he could stand between without feeling like he was about to be torn into. The winter that followed the night of the lost girl came in fits and stutters, as if the season itself could not decide whether to release its grip or sink its teeth in deeper. There were days when the snow softened underfoot and water ran in thin secret rivulets beneath the crust, and others when the sky turned hard and white, and the cold dropped so suddenly that trees cracked in the dark with sharp reports like distant gunshots. The wolf moved through all of it with a gait that had lost the last of its youthful uncertainty, his body now fully grown, his muscles carrying the memory of countless paths between cabin and valley and beyond. His coat had thickened against the cold, but under the fur the lines of him had grown leaner, honed by a rhythm of life that alternated between the easy meat of the cabin and the honest hunger of the forest. In the town below the ridge, his existence had begun to seep into conversation in ways none of the three in the cabin had planned. The lost girl's parents, white-faced and shaking, had listened to her halting description of the night the two tall trees, the breath that made clouds in the air, the bear she hadn't seen, but had felt in the vibrations of the ground, and the gray shape with the yellow eyes and the collar that had walked ahead of her, until the smell of smoke wrapped around them like a promise. At first, the adults around the table had traded skeptical looks over her head, their eyes sliding toward each other in silent exchanges that said fear makes stories, children imagine things, but the more she insisted on the details, the feel of coarse fur under her fingers, the wet heat of a nose nudging her knee. The way the animal had stopped and waited, whenever she stumbled the harder, it became to write it off as the product of a terrified mind. The man had said very little, which in its own way spoke volumes. He had mentioned finding her close to the cabin, said that his wolf had probably been drawn to her fear and shadowed her, that whatever else had happened out there between trees and creek and log, the important thing was that she was home. The sheriff had squinted at him across a mug of bitter coffee and asked a few pointed questions about safety and wild animals kept on leashes that were not always visible. But when he left, he had patted the wolf's head on the way out the door, his hand unsettling the fur just between the ears in an absent-minded motion that betrayed more acceptance than his words did. Word spread the way all stories in small towns do through muttered conversations in the diner over eggs, through the hiss of the gas pump and the clink of change at the hardware store, through kids repeating it with exaggerations on the school bus. Some said the animal had found her by accident, others that the man had trained him like a search dog, others still that the girl had imagined the collar in an effort to make sense of a wild thing that, by all accounts, should not have left her alive. Underneath the speculation ran something older and harder to name, a quiet reluctant awe at the idea that a creature everyone's fathers and grandfathers had been taught to fear as a livestock killer and a child stealer had, in this one instance, done the opposite. The wolf knew nothing of any of this talk in precise detail, but he felt its effects in subtle shifts in the world when he accompanied the man into town for feed or supplies. Car doors stayed closed now when they pulled into the lot, or opened more cautiously. Faces and windows turned to watch him not with the immediate, thoughtless hostility he had sometimes sensed before, but with a wary curiosity, eyes flicking to the collar, to the way he walked at the man's side, to the way he sat when told to sit. Children's hands pressed against glass, small mouths forming words he could not hear, but recognized in tone wolf, look, see, and more than once he caught the faint metallic tang of fear, softened by the sweeter smell of fascination. The night of the ravine came after a stretch of weather that had tempted even the cautious into risk. A brief warm spell had coaxed the ice on the higher slopes into a deceptive sheen of water, making old logging roads look passable, making hunting tracks seem less treacherous than they were. On the afternoon before, the man had stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets and watched a pickup truck with out-of-town plates rumble past on the road below, its bed loaded with gear orange caps bright against the gray sky in its cab. He had grunted, a sound that carried opinion without the need for words, and Emma, who had come to stand beside him with her school notebook, hugged to her chest, had wrinkled her nose in unconscious mimicry. Tourist, she had said, the single word holding a teenager's full inventory of judgment ignorance, carelessness, trouble. That night, the temperature dropped like a stone. Clouds moved in without much drama, just a slow thickening of the sky until the stars winked out one by one, and then the wind picked up, threading itself through the pines with a long, low moan that made the eaves of the cabin creak. The snow that fell was fine and dry, driven almost sideways by gusts that reached fingers under doors and through any crack in clothing or fur, turning breath into a constant battle against the urge to curl inward and conserve heat. The wolf stood at the window for a long time, watching the white blur outside, his paws shifting restlessly on the worn rug. The storm made the world feel both smaller and more dangerous. Scents were smeared, sounds muted, distances harder to judge. The call, when it came, was almost lost in the storm's voice, not a howl, not a bear's muffled bellow, but a thin, ragged shout that the wind shredded and tossed against the cabin's walls. The wolf's ears pricked. He turned his head, nose lifting, trying to catch scent through the snow's thick curtain. The man, at the table with a spread of maps and a pencil, paused, his hand freezing over the paper as his own, less finely tuned hearing caught the ghost of the sound. Emma, sprawled on the floor with a book open and the wolf's flank as her pillow, felt his muscles stiffen under her cheek and raised her head, her hair falling into her eyes. The second cry was less distinct, broken by coughs, but closer. The man was on his feet in an instant, the chair skidding back hard enough to leave a new scar in the floor. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, the heavy, well-worn one he used when a quick trip outside might become a long night. His hand went automatically to the flashlight on the nail, and then, after a brief hesitation, to the old first aid kit that usually sat on a shelf by the stove. Emma moved too, snatching her hat and gloves, her face pale but determined, her mouth already opening to say she was coming, and he halted her with a look, the unspoken calculation between the running fast storm, dark unknown voices, cliffs, and ravines out there. Stay, he said, the same word he had used for the wolf hundreds of times, but his eyes on his daughter turned it gentle, pleading. Keep the radio on. If I'm not back in 2 hours, you call. She swallowed hard, nodded once, that single drop of her chin containing all the things she wanted to argue, and all the ways she knew she would obey anyway. The wolf was already at the door, nails clicking on the wood, his whole body angled toward the howl's direction, his nose twitching as the snow's complex scents washed over him when the man cracked it open. The cold hit like a slap, sharp and blinding, filling the entryway with a rush of air that smelled of pine pitch splitting in the freeze, of fresh bruises to the world's surface. The man looked down at him, their eyes level for a moment that hung heavy with shared history, the bear, the fawn, the rabbit in the trap, the fox, the girl in the dark. He did not issue the command to stay this time. Instead, he jerked his head once, a brief wordless acknowledgement of the fact that there were places out there where paws would find faster, safer paths than boots alone. They plunged into the storm together, the flashlight's beam cutting a narrow wavering tunnel through the blowing white. For the wolf, the world shrank to that cone of light and the space just beyond it, where his own senses told him more than the human's tools could. The snow hurt his eyes when he looked straight into the wind. He blinked often, lashes collecting ice, his fur slicing through the drifts with the sound of cloth being torn. The man's breath came in harsh bursts behind him, slower than the animal would have gone alone, but steady, driven by the same stubborn core that had carried him into the forest to collect a dying pup 2 winters ago. The scent of the stranger who called for help pulled him forward, a jagged, desperate line of information that cut through the storm's smearing. It carried blood, sharp and fresh, and the sharp medicinal tang of a city man's soap, the faint stale sweetness of cigarettes, the rust of metal from a gun, and the sour rising panic of someone who had just realized the forest did not care about his confidence or his truck's four-wheel drive. The trail angled toward one of the ravines that sliced like old scars through the mountainside, places the wolf had learned to skirt in all seasons, their edges treacherous under snow, their bottoms collecting cold like bowls. He reached the lip before the man did, his paws skidding a little as the packed snow underfoot gave way to a steeper angle. He stopped in time, claws digging in, his body shifting to keep from sliding, and peered over, his pupils blown wide in the dim. The ravine fell away sharply, its walls a mix of exposed rock and hard-packed snow, scrub trees clinging to the sides in awkward thrusts. At the bottom, maybe 15 feet down, lay the human, half buried in drift, one leg twisted under him at a wrong angle, his face gray in the half-light, a smear of blood at his temple, startlingly bright against the washed-out world. His eyes were open but unfocused, blinking slowly as snowflakes landed on his lashes and melted there in tiny liquid beads before the cold claimed them. His breath fogged the air in thin, irregular puffs, each one seeming to cost him more effort than the last. The smell of pain rolled off him in waves, threaded with the dull earthy odor of bones swollen with trauma, of muscles torn, of a body already beginning to shut down functions it deemed non-essential in the face of cold and concussion. The man reached the edge a few seconds later, his boots sliding the last foot, his hand grabbing a sapling to keep from going over. He cursed under his breath when he saw the scene below, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking quickly along the ravine's sides, measuring possibilities. The walls were too steep and slick to climb down safely in this light without rope. Any misstep would send him into a fall that might break his own leg, turning one casualty into two. The stranger below seemed lucid enough to be aware of the now, his gaze, sluggish, dragged up the slope, finding first the man's silhouette above, and then the wolf's head beside him, ears pricked, breath steaming. For a moment, a flash of primal terror lit the hunter's face, not at the fall or the injury, but at the sight of a wolf, large and solid in clothes, staring down at him while he lay broken in a pity he could not escape. Even in that fear, though, there was a flicker of recognition, the lizard brain awareness that this wolf wore a band of leather around its neck, that it stood side by side with a human rather than alone. Confusion warred with the older stories of the wild that had filled his childhood, wolves circling the dying, wolves dragged from under porches with blood on their muzzles. The man shouted down, his voice snatched and thrown by the wind, but still mostly intelligible assurances, instructions, the promise that he would not be left. The stranger's lips moved in response, forming fragments of words slipped. Ice, thought it was solid, ankle, gun punctuated by groans when he tried to shift his weight. The wolf watched it all, his eyes tracking every movement, his mind already thinking past the immediate scene to the larger shape of the forest between here and town. They could not haul the man up themselves, not quickly enough, not in this weather, not without risking their own limbs on the slick rock. The only way to save him in time was to bring others, hands and ropes and blankets, and perhaps a stretcher from somewhere that still had bright lights and stocked cupboards. Humans called each other with wires and waves and devices that hummed and glowed. Their voices traveled invisibly when they pressed buttons and held plastic to their ears. Those systems began, though, in bodies that had to move to where the devices were. The man's radio in the cabin had only so much reach. Emma's hands were small. The town, with its phone lines and emergency numbers, was farther than her boots could carry her in a storm, before the stranger's slow, irregular breaths stopped. The wolf looked up toward where the road ran, invisible under the snow, but present in his mental map as a faint lingering scent of oil and rubber and exhaust, and then back down at the man in the ravine, his teeth chattering now in a rattling rhythm that spoke of a body losing its grip on temperature. He leaned into the man's thigh with his shoulder, testing the reaction, and the human's moan confirmed what his nose already knew: that leg was not to be moved if they could help it. The bones there no longer aligned, the tissue protesting even slight pressure. He made his choice. Without waiting for a command or a plan spoken in a language he could not fully share, he turned away from the ravine and bolted up the slope, his paws finding purchase where the man's boots had slipped, his body cutting through the blowing snow with the single-minded speed of something chasing survival. The man called after him once, a sharp shout of his name that carried both fear of losing him and a flash of understanding. Then the human turned back to the ravine, his voice dropping into a steady stream of sound directed at the injured stranger, words meant to keep him awake, to anchor him in the moment, so that he did not drift off into the snow's welcoming numbness. The road, when the wolf reached it, was a solid white band under the storm, its edges blurred into the ditches and the fields beyond. He ran along it toward the town, his paws slipping occasionally on hidden ice, and then correcting, his breath sawing in and out of his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had never gone this far alone toward the human cluster before. Usually he rode in the truck or waited at its edge while the man went in. Tonight the need at his back, the slow failing breaths, the smell of blood pushed him beyond the boundaries of habit. Lights appeared ahead, diffuse halos in the swirling snow marking the first houses on the outskirts. The closer he got, the more the smells changed wood smoke, giving way to the sharper sense of gasoline, garbage bins, cooking grease, laundry vent exhaust, and the dense layered perfume of many humans living close together. The storm muffled the usual noise of such places, tamping down the hum of televisions and the thump of music, leaving only the occasional bark of a dog, the clank of a door, the slap of boots on a porch. He slowed only slightly as he entered the first real street, his presence causing a minor shock wave of reaction. A dog behind a fence launched into frantic barking, throwing itself against the chain link, its eyes rolling and teeth bared. A curtain twitched up in a window, a pale face peering out, a car door halfway closed stayed open. The driver frozen with one foot in, one out, keys in hand, as the wolf's gray shape loped past in the beam of the streetlight. He did not stop to read their fear, their disbelief. He headed for the building he recognized by smell as the place where uniforms gathered, where sirens sometimes began their shrieks. The sheriff's office, near the small square with its flagpole and its sad little metal bench half buried in snow. He bounded up onto the porch in 2 strides and slammed into the door with his shoulder, making it rattle in its frame. Inside, voices cut off abruptly, the murmur of conversation and the scratch of papers silenced as the impact registered. A moment later, the door swung open, a wave of warm air billowing out, carrying with it the smells of coffee, paper, wet wool, and gun oil. The sheriff stood there with a styrofoam cup in his hand and his hat pushed back on his head, his mouth already forming a reprimand for whoever was slamming into county property, before the side in front of him rearranged his words into a shocked whispered curse. The wolf stood on the threshold, sides heaving, steam rising from his coat, his eyes white and bright, snow clinging in little clumps to his whiskers. He pushed past the sheriff's legs into the office, ignoring the startled exclamations and scraping chairs, and turned, basing his whole strategy on the one thing he knew could communicate urgency across the species gap: motion. He barked, a sharp ringing sound that cut through the small room, then pivoted and ran back toward the door, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they were watching. He repeated this twice, the pattern clear here. Come, now his tail high with tension, his ears pricked forward. The deputies, there were 2 in the room besides the sheriff, their badges glinting, their faces frozen somewhere between amusement and alarm, exchanged looks that said they had, until this moment, believed every story about this wolf was overblown. The sheriff, however, had seen him at the cabin door, had heard the lost girl's account, had noted the way the animal had sat without being told in the yard while he inspected fences. He put his coffee down slowly, never taking his eyes from the wolf, and his voice when he spoke, carried the clipped edge of someone dropping their skepticism in favor of old, simpler instincts. "Something's wrong up there," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Get your coats and the stretcher. If I'm wrong, we'll have a good laugh about it later." They were not wrong. The truck roared to life, its engine coughing before settling into a steady growl, the plow on its front angled to shove snow aside as they pulled out of the lot. The wolf ran ahead of it at first, guiding it out of town, then fell to the site as the road's width narrowed, keeping pace with the headlights, the beam carving a moving tunnel in the storm. Inside the cab, the men spoke into radios, their voices clipped and professional, calling in the situation as an unknown injury on the ridge, possible fall, severe weather. The siren remained mercifully silent. There was no one to warn out here but the trees. When they reached the turnoff to the old logging road that led toward the ravine, the wolf veered off without hesitation, plunging into the deeper drifts, trusting that the humans would follow as far as their machine allowed and then on foot when it could not. The truck jolted to a halt where the snow became too much even for its heavy tires. Doors flew open, boots hit the ground, gear clanked and rustled as ropes were slung over shoulders, the stretcher pulled from the bed. Flashlights snapped on, their beams ducking and weaving as the men adjusted to the shadowed undergrowth. Up on the ravine lip, the man's shout cut through the wind, answering their own. He raised his arm, flashlight in hand, signaling where he stood. His face looked older in the harsh upsweep of light, lines etched deeper by worry and cold. His beard rhymed with frost, but his voice carried that same grounded steadiness, as he called down updates to the stranger below, and then up instructions to the rescue crew. The wolf stood a few yards away, panting, his body vibrating with a mixture of exhaustion and readiness, as if his muscles had not yet realized the hardest part of his task was done. The rest unfolded in a flurry of human efficiency ropes anchored to stout trees, one deputy lowering himself carefully over the edge. The stretcher eased down and then hauled up again with a combination of hand-over-hand strength and careful coordination. The injured man cried out once or twice, short, sharp sounds bitten off almost before they escaped, and the wolf flinched at each, his ears flattening, his tail tucked slightly but not fully. Pain was a language he understood intimately. When the stranger's limp form finally rose into view, strapped securely to the stretcher, his face ashen, his lips tinged blue, the wolf stepped closer, drawn in a way he could not quite articulate. The hunter's eyes fluttered open as the cold wind slapped at him anew on the ravine's edge, and the first thing they focused on was not the circle of human faces bent over him, nor the bright unblinking eye of the flashlight, but the wolf standing just beyond, his silhouette a dark solid shape against the blowing snow. Confusion cleared enough from his gaze for something like recognition to surface, and his cracked lips moved in a hoarse whisper that none of the others fully caught under the wind's roar, but whose shape the wolf could read in the subtle shifts of muscle and breath. "You came back." He had not, in fact, never been here before with this man, but in that moment, with the memory of terror in the ravine's depths and the sudden improbable appearance of 2 legs and 4 paws at its edge, the hunter's mind folded this wolf into some larger, older story of guides and saviors that people tell themselves when the wild shows mercy. His hand twitched, fingers clawing weakly at the air, and by accident or design, they brushed the coarse fur along the wolf's muzzle as the stretcher jostled past. The touch was brief and clumsy, but it carried with it a flood of scent and sensation, that the animal filed away blood, fear, gratitude, the stale tang of long hours in a truck, the faint ghost of a child's shampoo somewhere underneath, suggesting a life beyond this moment that included more than guns and solitude. Back in town, the story, when told, would compress these complex layered minutes into a cleaner arc. People would say the hunter had fallen into a ravine on the ridge during the storm, that he would have frozen or bled out if help had not arrived when it did. They would say that the man on the slope had called, yes, but that his radio's range was limited, that the road had been nearly impassable, that would have brought the sheriff to his door in time, had been the sudden insistent appearance of a gray wolf wearing a collar, slamming into the station's door, and then leading the truck out into the blizzard with a determination that brooked no doubt. Some would scoff at first, calling it luck, coincidence, a set of accidents stitched together by frightened minds into a narrative. Others, especially those who had seen the animal's eyes in their beams that night, would shake their heads and say there was more to it, that the world held stranger loyalties than the old stories allowed. The injured man himself, when he was awake enough in the hospital bed, would tell anyone who asked, and many who did not, how he had lain at the bottom of the ravine and stared at the wolf above him and thought was seeing his last sight, only to feel the cold mark of a nose at his leg, then hear the animal's paws fade away, and then, minutes or hours later, the crunch of boots and the glare of lights. He would insist, his voice rough with the memory, that it had not just wandered by, it had gone and brought people, it had chosen. The wolf would not hear these retellings, not in the way humans told them to each other over counters and at gas pumps, but sensed the shift in the town's air on the next trip down. The fierce smell was still there, in places in the stiff way some men held their bodies when he passed, in the way hand state a little too close to the butts of guns out of habit. But there was deference mingled in now too, curiosity from quarters where there had been only hostility before. Children tugged at sleeves, whispering that's him, that's the one, their voices bubbling with excitement, and old-timers fell silent as he went by, their eyes following him with a respect they might not yet have been ready to name. Back on the ridge, by the stove's steady crackle, the man would sometimes rest his hand on the wolf's neck a little longer than necessary, his thumb tracing unconsciously over the scar that still marked where the bear's claws had once torn fur and skin, the first wound in this long chain of becoming. Emma, curled with a book in the chair, would glance up and smile in that slow way she had when something in the room felt exactly right, and outside, under the trees, foxes and deer, and even some of his own kind moved through the snow, the night air carrying with it a rumor that was not quite yet a full story, but was on its way. Somewhere on this ridge there walked a wolf who tore traps, who stood before teeth, who led lost children and broken men to warmth, and in whose scent the wild and the human sat together, not always in peace, but no longer entirely at war. By the time the summer came that sat like a warm hand on the ridge, the wolf's muzzle had gone silver in a way that crept up so slowly. No one in the cabin could say exactly when the first white hairs had appeared. His eyes were still clear, still that deep reflective amber that caught the light and threw it back with a hint of something thinking behind it. But the fur along his flanks lay a little looser over muscles that no longer carried him through the forest with the same effortless speed. Scars, once thin pale lines under thick coat, had risen closer to the surface as age thinned the fur, a map of his life inked in old damage, the diagonal slash of the bear, the faint puckered marks on his foreleg from his brother's teeth, the scattered little nicks that came from underbrush, traps, and the innumerable minor collisions with an untidy world. The cabin itself had changed in quieter ways. A new section of porch wrapped around its side now, boards bleached by sun and weather, the result of a spring when the man and Emma taller, sharper featured now, a woman more than a girl had decided that more space was needed for mornings when no one wanted to be entirely inside or out. Flower boxes hung under the windows, overflowing with hardy wildflowers Emma had coaxed into domesticity, their colors like small defiant flags against the dark wood. On the inside walls, drawings and photographs had accumulated pencil sketches of the creek, of trees, of a wolf's head seen from memory, and pinned between them, faded snapshots of Emma at various ages, of her father younger and less lined, of a gray shape lying at the man's feet or under the kitchen table, eyes half closed. The yard, which had once been a simple patch of beaten earth and grass, where Emma threw a ball to a gangly adolescent wolf, now bore the marks of more feet, more games. A swing hung from a sturdy branch of the nearest pine, its ropes rubbed smooth by use, and the ground under it was bare in a wide crescent where many small shoes had scuffed. There were tracks of more than one size of dog and wolf in the dirt, some lighter, some heavier, weaving in overlapping loops that told their own stories. On some evenings, especially when the town kids came up on weekends with their parents to bring gifts of pies and stories, the yard filled with a tangle of bodies that blurred the line between species, children running with wolf pups at their heels, hand buried in fur, tails thumping against bare legs, laughter, and yips bouncing off the cabin walls. The old wolf lay on the slope above it all on a patch of grass he had worn his shape into over countless afternoons, his body curved just enough that his ribs rose and fell easily, his head resting on his forepaws. From this vantage point he could see the yard below and the edge of the forest behind, the town's faint smudge on the horizon where the valley opened up. The sun had begun its slow drop toward the distant hills, the light slanting in long bars through the trees, turning every dust mote and insect into a drifting speck of gold. The air was warm, carrying the thick, sweet smell of sun, warmed pine and dry earth, threaded with the lighter sense of crushed grass, and the sharper, busier smell of children who had spent the day running. Below, two of his own blood moved in the chaos with the kind of grace only half-grown animals have, all long legs and sudden bursts of speed that made their younger cousins both canine and human squeal in delighted outrage. One was a lean gray young wolf with a darker streak along his spine, eyes that mirrored the old male's own, the line of his jaw, a clear echo of the father's younger face. The other bore a reddish cast to her coat, a nod to some fox ancestor long before, her movements quick and precise, her ears constantly twitching. They flowed in and out of a group of kids from town like currents in water, sometimes leading, sometimes following, always aware of each other's positions, tails flagged high with enjoyment rather than dominance. The children's scents carried from below sunscreen and sweat, the ghost of dish soap on recently washed shirts, the faint chemical tang of plastic toys, the organic messy smell of grass stains and scraped knees. Interwoven with them was the now familiar smell of their parents' cautious but genuine acceptance, a mix of coffee and gasoline and faint traces of office or factory air, overlaid with the wild that clung to them after a day on the ridge. Laughter rose in bursts, high and clear, punctuated by the occasional thud of a fall, and the ensuing chorus of concerned voices, followed by reassurance and the resumption of play. From the trees behind him came another presence, older, heavier, moving with a measured pace that spoke more of consideration than of weakness. The old wolf lifted his head and turned, his ears pricking, as his brother stepped out from between the trunks, his own muzzle streaked with gray now, his shoulders still broad but softened by time. The years had laid their work onto him as well, smoothing some of the sharp edges that had once seemed carved from challenge and pride. His eyes, when they met the elders, held none of the anger that had flared there at the fox in the snow. Instead, they carried a kind of weary wisdom, an understanding that had come more slowly to him, perhaps, but had come nonetheless. They regarded each other in silence for a moment, the space between them filled with the ghosts of all the arguments and hunts they had not shared, the paths taken separately that might, in another life, have been trodden side by side. Then the brother lowered himself onto the grass next to the old wolf, their shoulders almost touching, their bodies aligned in the way wolves have when they sit together at rest, facing the same direction, reading the world with a shared attention. The sense that clung to the brother's fur told stories of the pack's current state pups, new and noisy, and old matriarchs fading, a rival driven off or gone, the usual constellations of life and death that spun in the forest regardless of individual dramas. For a while they simply watched the scene below, young wolves and young humans making up games on the fly, rules created and discarded with joyful arbitrariness, the patch of yard that had once seemed a foreign human space, now as much a part of the wild story as any clearing. A boy with freckles and grass-stained knees threw a stick much too hard. One of the wolf pups streaked after it with an exuberant sprint, overshot, skidded, tumbled in a rolling cloud of dust and fur that made everyone watching break into laughter, and came up shaking himself vigorously, his tongue lolling in embarrassed delight. A little girl with a missing front tooth clung to the neck of the reddish young wolf, her fingers buried deep in the thick fur, and the animal tolerated the weight with patient ease, only occasionally twisting her head to lick the child's ear, which produced shrieks and giggles. The brother's gaze lingered on that last pair, his eyes narrowing in thought. When he spoke, his voice came out as a low rumbling woof that the human ear would have dismissed as a simple exhale, but that carried layers in their language: curiosity, acknowledgement, and finally, concession. "You're right," he said without words, the meanings woven into the direction of his breath, the tilt of his ears, the slight dip of his head. "There is another way." The old wolf's chest rose and fell, the movement slow, his ribs more prominent than they had been in his prime, but his eyes brightened at the admission. He turned his head slightly to look at his brother, taking in the lines carved by time around his muzzle, the softened set of his mouth, the way his body, once always coiled for the next confrontation, now lay easier on the earth. He bumped his nose lightly against the other's neck, a gesture that encompassed forgiveness, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing a long-argued point finally land. Below, Emma stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her hair pinned up haphazardly, stray wisps glowing in the low sun. She was older now, lines beginning to mark the corners of her eyes from years of squinting into light and laughing. Her movements carried the grounded assurance of someone who had made a life in a place and had no intention of leaving it. She whistled, a clear carrying note that cut through the din in the yard, and the swarm of children and wolves turned taut or in a loose wave. Her voice followed, calling names, assigning tasks: water, wash up, supper, and the practiced rhythm of obedience and minor rebellion began, kids groaning, pups shaking off play bounces, everyone drifting gradually toward the house and the smell of food. Among the moving shapes, a young wolf broke away from the main cluster and started up the slope toward the two older males. His coat was a mottled mix of gray and brown, his limbs still learning their full strength, his eyes bright with that combination of excitement and uncertainty that marks someone on the cusp of choosing who they would become. The scents on him were of blend cabin, forest, town smoke and sap, and gasoline and river mud, the complex perfume of a creature who had, from the start, walked a path that did not recognize the old boundaries as absolute. He approached with the respectful eagerness of youth, his tail low, but wagging, his head dipped slightly, his body language an open question. When he reached them, he sat, then lay down with his paws stretched out in front of him, his eyes flicking from the old wolf to the brother and back again, as if weighing which stories each might hold. He made a small questioning sound in his throat, one the old wolf recognized instantly from a lifetime of hearing the same tone in Emma's voice, in the lost girl's, in the man's, when he asked a question of the air, a request for guidance, for sense, for some kind of framework to hold the world in. The old wolf shifted, lifting his head a little higher, despite the stiffness that protested in his neck, and looked out over the yard and the trees beyond, letting his gaze run along the invisible lines that connected all the parts of his life, from the den in the snow, where he had last felt his mother's breath, to the warm smoky box where he had first opened his eyes to human walls, to the crack of the bear's claw, the softness of Emma's small hands, the sting of his brother's teeth, the creak of the trap's springs, the fox's trembling flank, the bear's smell in the dark, the lost girl's fingers in his fur, the stranger's weak grasp on his muzzle at the ravine's edge. He did not have words to wrap these things in, no neat sentences to hand to the young one at his paws, but he had the weight of them, the way they sat in his bones and shaped the way he moved through the world. He touched his nose briefly to the younger wolf's forehead, a small precise contact that passed along, in their own mute way, the knowledge that strength had many faces, teeth, yes, and speed, and the ability to survive a winter's scarcity, but also the willingness to stand in the empty space between worlds and hold it open, even when both sides howled. The breeze shifted, carrying with it the mingled sounds of the yard, a pot clanking on the stove, a child arguing weakly about vegetables, a wolf pup's delighted yip at the smell of meat, and the more distant chorus of the pack somewhere on the far ridge, their howls rising in the familiar patterns of greeting and boundary and status. The old wolf listened to both, his ears flicking, his breathing slow, his heartbeat steady but lighter than it had been in many years. He did not feel torn now when the forest called or when the cabin's light spilled into the night. He felt, instead, a sense of completion, as if the long, painful process of reconciling his two selves had finally reached a point where they did not collide, but overlapped. His eyes drifted half-closed as the sun sank lower, the warmth on his fur gentle and soothing, and in the soft blur that came with the onset of a doze, he saw the shapes below not as separate groups, but as a single, moving tapestry wolves and humans and dogs and children, all sharing the same patch of earth without immediate fear, their lives weaving in and out of each other's in small everyday ways that, when added up over time, became something like peace. He knew, in the honest part of himself that had seen winters thin the ranks and traps take the unwary, that there would always be teeth in the dark, that storms would still come, that fear and hunger could still drive creatures to terrible choices. The world had not been remade by his axe into something kinder at its core. But it had been nudged. Paths that had not existed before were now worn into the ground by many paws and boots. Trustful gestures that had once been impossible were now taken for granted, a child's hand in a wolf's ruff, a hunter's rifle lowered when Gray moved at the edge of his vision, an alpha allowing his subordinate to stand between pack and prey without blood-demanding payment. Those were small things in the scale of mountains and centuries, but they were also the only kind of things that mattered, the only kind of changes that ever stuck because they lived in bodies and habits, not just in stories told on long winter nights. He exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to carry out of him the last of the old tight tension that had once made his skin feel too small. The younger wolf at his paws shifted closer, his shoulder pressing lightly against the old male's, the contact a quiet affirmation that there would be someone to remember, someone to keep walking the lines he had opened. The brother's flank warmed his other side, the steady beat of his heart, a reminder that reconciliation, while never promised, was possible. As the light thinned and the first stars blinked awake overhead, the forest sounds changed gradually to their night register: crickets starting up in the grass, an owl taking over from the day's hawk, the creek's voice slipping into a lower, more secretive murmur. Down in the cabin, voices drifted out through an open window, Emma's laugh unmistakable among them, the man's lower tone answering, other voices from town threading in and out as plates clinked and chairs scraped. On a wall near the door, tacked among photos and sketches, a piece of paper fluttered slightly in the breeze. Its edges curled a child's drawing of a wolf with a collar standing between a house and a line of trees, stick figure people, and little scribbled pups at its feet, all orbiting the same crude, lovingly drawn shape. The old wolf's eyes closed fully, his breath settling into the slow, deep rhythm of true rest, rather than the light doze of constant vigilance. In his last waking flicker of awareness, before sleep took him into the kind of dreams that run in fields beyond anyone's call, there was no sense of exile, no sharp awareness of belonging entirely to one site or the other. There was only the simple, profound truth that he had lived as himself, teeth and scars and all, and that, in doing so, he had helped carve, in this small corner of forest and town, a wider path for others to walk, where being one thing did not have to mean shutting the door on being anything else.